run our things, or are you going to have, I guess Jane's going to outline my part.
Yeah, they're on the laptop. So we're just
Good.
putting up yours right now.
Okay. And then at the very end of mine, you have that resolution, right? Is that on another slide?
Oh, Bob, whenever you want me to.
That'll be the last one.
toggle it.
Okay, that's the last thing I'm going to do.
Okay.
Okay. We might as well get...
You're talking about the charter, right? Oh.
No, I was talking about the recent resolution that Tony put on separate. Okay. We'll figure it out when you get there. Okay. Do you all have everybody books? Okay. Well, my name is Bob Waldman with the City Attorney's Office, and everybody up here is with the City Attorney's Office. Nick Bullock, Jane Yee, Eric Loper. And we're going to try to go over, I know the charter requires a training for new members of the Ethics Board. I think we have some new people. Some people have been on it for a while, and you may know a lot more about it than we do, but you can add to it and fill in the gaps where we have them. And if you have any questions, ask us. Hopefully one of the four of us will be able to answer them. We did pass out some materials. I'm going to go a lot by the materials that I worked on, and we'll kind of go through those as we go over them. Let's go over the training materials. I wanted to start. I'm going to speak generally about the Ethics Board, and I'm going to be reading and summarizing the charter. The Ethics Board is created by the city charter, which is basically in an analogy to the federal government. That's our Constitution. So it is the highest authority for the city, and it's one of the very I had the job of trying to make a list of all the boards and commissions for the city in connection with some litigation that we did earlier this year. I found there's 74 boards and commissions, everything from the Balloon Park Board, museum boards, Veterans Affairs Board. They really run the spectrum. They're almost all created by legislative action, by city ordinances, city resolutions, except the Ethics Board is important enough that it isn't in the city charter. It's an integral part of city government, and it really has the duties to oversee the actions of the city officials and elections, and just to make sure that things are being followed and there's some kind of a oversight when necessary. The importance of it, I think, is shown, and the materials I did that on my part of the presentation are 1 and 2. But I went to the city website to see how the city communicates the importance of the Ethics Board to the public, and what the importance was considered by the city administration. And I printed out the last page of the current city website. I'm sorry, the last page of the materials, page 38 of section 2 of the materials that I did, basically talk about what is conveyed to the public on the city's website concerning the duties, responsibilities of the Ethics Board. And I just want to read that to you because this is the goal that we're trying to set. Board duties, it says the board may conduct investigations regarding possible violations of the Ethics Code, the Open and Ethical Elections Code, and the Code of Ethics. Now those are 3 sections of the city charter. The board may also issue advisory opinions at the request of city officials and candidates. The Office of City Clerk retains all board opinions as permanent records. The board, the other sections talk about the boards can make rules and regulations, which are available, in fact, required to be given to candidates running for office. And the board consists of 6 appointed members, and then the 6th chooses 7th. So there's a real significant, importance to the Board of Ethics. And if you go and again in section 2 to the first page, I did a table of contents for the city charter, and you'll see that sections 12, the Code of Ethics, again very much incorporates and specifies the Board of Ethics duties. Also, the Election Code, Article 13, and to some extent the last article, Article 16, about open and ethical election codes. I'm particularly going to speak in my part of the presentation concerning 12 and 13, Code of Ethics and Election Code, because those are the two duties, areas in which the Board's of Ethics duties are specified and pretty well established as a framework to what you're going to be doing. We are going to have several people speak about different topics. Again, mine is really the more the nuts and bolts of the city charter provisions. And then we'll talk a little bit about issues that we thought were going to be important that you should know about. One being IPRA, the Inspection of Public Records Act, in which, as you're here, you will get requests for inspection of public records, and the records that you keep and the documents you create in your job and your duties on the board are public records. So just how to what to expect and how to deal with them. Also, we go under the Open Meetings Act. This board is under the Open Meetings Act, and there are certain rules and regulations you need to comply with, and so those are in addition to really the nuts and bolts of the substantive duties under the charter. But things we thought we were talking about is what you need to know about and what we can communicate to you.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Before you get going, on the seventh member,
Yes.
is that someone that is already a member of the board that we
As I
so
understand,
recruit?
okay, and okay, I may refer to the clerk on that. I have an understanding, but I may be wrong. You're more up to date on it.
I'm Lisa Duff. The board, it's the 6 members, and then 6 members nominate another individual.
Right.
And then I believe the board, as a whole, votes on, if they get more than one nominee, then they vote on who the board chair is going to be.
Okay.
Or if there's just one, I believe still that the board votes on that.
And the seventh member is the chairman. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's my understanding. Well, what's the status of that right now? I know I'm not up to date on that.
We are getting nominations, so if any of the board members have any nominations, if they can please provide those names to Natalie. And I believe that we have to post their name to the website as well for 2 weeks to see if we get any public comment or anything like that. So again, if anybody has any names, I know that there was a talk that, she probably gave us her name. I think that the board members can discuss that as well.
Okay. Ready?
I think George's question was, can you appoint an existing member
Yeah, I was just-
as the chair? And the way I read it, you can't. It seems like the 6 appointed members have to elect the 7th, who's not voting.
And am I correct that the 7th board member becomes the chair?
Yes.
Okay. Good. So it's 7 altogether. I want to start with the outline that's in section 1, and that's what I'm going to be going over. We took the charter provisions that applied to the board and tried to just put them in an order as opposed to what order they are in the charter as to who, what, where, duties, applicability, and tried to group them into something I think will make more sense than just going over all the provisions one by one. But I think all this needs to start with a declaration of policy. and that is what is the overall vision and overall duties of the Board of Ethics. And I'm just going to go over this. It's pretty much the Declaration of Policy, which is Section 1 of the election code. Of the Code of Ethics. And it just states that the proper administration of a democratic government requires public officials who are independent, impartial, and responsible. Government decisions that are made in the best interest of the people, community, and government. And the public is governed has a confidence in the integrity of the government. And then the Code of Ethics goes on to say in its Declaration of Policy, in recognition of these goals, the following Code of Ethics shall apply to all officials of the city. And so the second part has to do more with elections. And that's the second basic goal. There are two sections and two fundamental goals of the Board of Ethics. And the first one is overseeing public officials after they're elected. And the second one is before public officials are elected, overseeing the election process and making sure that we get all information that should be made public, all sufficient disclosures from candidates, and also preventing conflicts of interest or establishing what are conflicts of interest and preventing those from interfering with the duties of elected officials and people are going to run for office. So the second part of the Declaration of Policy goes to campaign practices. And it goes on to say the public disclosure and regulation of certain campaign practices will serve to increase public confidence in the integrity of the government by informing the public of the qualifications of the candidates, possible sources of influence, financing, and campaigns. So broadly speaking, those are the two areas in which the Board of Ethics will act. So who makes up the Board of Ethics and campaign practices? We talked about this a minute ago. There are 3 members nominated by the mayor, 3 members nominated by city council, and a chairperson who is selected by the 6 members. Now, you'll get yourself oriented into the process in the nomination process, because the nomination process requires resumes to be posted on the city website, and also requires public comment. And so you're looking at the same process that we're going to be requiring from public officials and from people running for office, starting with your nominations and appointment to the board. Terms are for 4 years. They are rolling terms, and everybody doesn't start and stop at the same time. They go in the middle of the term. We have new elections. A board member can serve 2 consecutive terms, and so there are some term limits. Now, after the 2 terms, you can be elected to start again. So it's not a lifetime 2 terms, but it's 2 consecutive terms. Briefly, I want to go, what are the duties of the board? And the board oversees enforcement of the Code of Ethics.
Did you want to take questions in between?
Sure.
Okay, so going back to the board members, so the 6 board members will choose a chairperson, and we do have to also put their resume on the web for at least 2 weeks. But what about council? Do they have to approve?
As I read it, no. Because the other board members are either appointed by council or by the mayor, and so there's no interaction. So I don't believe so.
That's what Rex thought as well.
And I don't really know where public comment comes into that either about who gets it. Usually when you have the members they're going to be appointed by city council. You're going to post the resume. It's going to go on the website. You're going to get public comments at city council meetings. Public comments on the mayors will go to the mayor by email or phone or however they want to communicate to the mayor. I don't really see where public comments fits into the person that you mutually select to be the chairman.
It probably has to be selected in a public meeting and it would be an agenda item, I guess. There would be an opportunity.
That would make sense. And it makes sense to have it in one of your meetings. And as I said, and the meetings are all open meetings, so the public does have a chance to comment on them at that time. Okay, so let me go into the duties of the board. First is attending 6 hours of training on their ethical responsibilities and ethics and election codes. We'll have most of that done today. We're going to try to go successive with the city clerk, so we combine the city attorney's training with what the city clerk's going to do later this afternoon. Okay, having copies of the city charter and board's rules and regulations available for candidates and chairpersons of the Measure Finance Committees. Measure Finance Committees is, I can read the definition, it's pretty much political action committees. It's the group that gets together and gets campaign contributions and then submits that contribution, the contribution in their name. And I believe the city clerk passes out, am I right, the copies of the charter and the rules and regulations when somebody comes in with a nominating petition. But again, it's the board's job to make sure that's done. Requiring candidates and chairpersons of the Measure Finance Committees to acknowledge receipt and knowledge of the election code and the board's rules and regulations. So I expect that when somebody comes in with a nomination petitions, that those are available and there's just a receipt that the person has to sign to make sure they've obtained the materials. Receiving and maintaining the file on file candidate disclosure statements. And I'll talk a little bit about what the disclosure statements are. Much of that's done, I think it's all done by the city clerk's office, but it's the board's duties to make sure it's done and that everything's available. Again, receiving and maintaining campaign finance disclosure reports from candidates. Again, that will go through the requirements of disclosure, financial disclosure from candidates. But again, that's a record that's kept by the city clerk and certainly made available to the public. Receiving and maintaining on-file campaign materials. Again, that's another function of the city clerk, but it's the commission's job to make sure it's done and to take enforcement remedies if it's not done. And the city clerk is responsible for making sure that the materials are received, available to the public when requested. Receiving charges and violations of the Code of Ethics and the Election Code. So if there's a complaint that you know of, it can be brought by the board itself. If either a public official or there's a campaign violation, the board on itself can review and investigate and make recommendations. Very often the charges and violations will be coming from a member of the public, sometimes even during an election from the opposing candidate. And it's really the board's job to investigate and make recommendations if they find there is a violation and if it's serious and requires further action. Determining whether a violation has occurred, as I said, that's the investigation, the hearing process. The board does have access to the investigations of the city itself and also to hire an outside investigator. Determining and imposing penalties for violations. This can be everything from a reprimand to a fine, to if it's something serious enough to recommend the city council that person be removed from office. Again, it all depends on seriousness and if there is a real violation and how serious it is. Okay, so what authority does the board have to carry out its duties? Again, the board does retain a certified public accountant to serve as the campaign and election auditor. So you don't have to do it all yourself. There are provisions to retain a CPA to make sure that the campaign finance information is all properly disclosed and filed with the city clerk's office. To hold preliminary hearings when you get a complaint, the board has the authority to take testimony, even subpoena power, to take required testimony, and they also can hire an investigator to do the investigations. That's number 3, to investigate the allegations with the subpoena power. To issue and amend rules and regulations. I think Nick will go over more of what the rules and regulations are, but you do have the power to make your own processes. And you now have those in existence, and they can be changed if necessary. To issue advisory opinions. And I think that's a pretty important function right there, because if somebody comes to you and says, can I do this legally? Then the board can and should give an advisory opinion of yes, you can, or no, you can't. And people may want that as a safeguard, first of all, not to get in trouble, but mostly to know what to do. What can you legally do, and what can't you do? Also, those opinions that you do are filed with the city clerk's office, and I won't say they're necessarily precedent value, but at least they'll certainly, candidates in the future will look to those for guidance, because they'll have the same issues in the next election and questions in the next election that somebody may be having in the current election.
Are you aware if the board has ever issued an advisory opinion?
That I don't know. I don't know if any,
Has the board ever issued an advisory opinion?
yeah.
I don't know, I've been on for 3 years.
Lucretia, do you have any idea, historically, has the board ever issued an advisory opinion? Lucinda?
I don't believe so.
Lucinda? Okay.
I don't think so. I mean, last election was my first
Mhm.
times, but I don't believe that any were issued.
Seems like things move so quickly once that cycle starts.
And that's true. Most of the questions would just come up a couple, weeks before an election when somebody has a question. But the power is there if you're asked. And as I said, I think it's a real service to give the candidates, just so they'll know what you can do and what you can't do. Because most people want to follow the rules, but they don't always know the answer.
Yeah, by the time the board got around to issuing the opinion.
That's right. It may not help for that election. Next step is holding evidentiary hearings according to the process in the board's rules and regulations. Impose penalties if necessary, which can go all the way from reprimands to fines, to actually recommend to council that a appointed or employed official be suspended or removed from office, or an elected official be removed from office. Again, the board can't remove somebody from office, but that's probably the strongest type of punishment that the board could hand out, and let the city council make that final decision. So, what are the conditions on a board's members' exercise of authority? The board may not participate in proceedings involving the campaign of candidates or measures that he or she has contributed to or participated in. This is the same type of conflict of interest that the board is being asked to monitor for public officials, and so the same restrictions on members of the board. But the board may not waive automatic mandatory fines and penalties. Now, those mandatory fines and penalties are for lack of disclosure by a candidate or late disclosure. While the board has a lot of leeway on what they can do, they can't waive the automatic penalties for late filing or failure to file. And those are set, they're in Section 10 of the Election Code. The board must follow its own rules and regulations unless there's a conflict with the codes. I can tell you from my years in the city attorney's office, mostly looking at administrative boards and litigation, that if something ends up going to court, the court primarily looks at the procedure. You have a lot of leeway. You're given the job to enforce different aspects of the election code and of the ethics code. And but when the procedure isn't followed properly, things are very often set aside, like they are for most other city committees and boards. So it's important to make sure the procedure is done properly. And again, there's a lot of discretion in a court. Will give you a lot of discretion on how you rule, but procedurally is the biggest weakness where things get set aside. Okay, so who is covered by the Board of Ethics? I found this one really interesting because the mayors and all members of City Council you would expect to be covered by the Board of Ethics. Members of boards, commissions, and committees, okay, yourselves and other boards and commissions of the city. Director of Council Services, the Chief Administrative Officer. So far I've all gone to the high officials appointed or elected. Directors or deputy directors of the divisions of the city government. Again, you're looking at the people very often being elected, being appointed by the mayor's office or by the council. All other city employees appointed by council, the mayor, or the chief administrative officer. Well, I thought I was interested that when they talk about immediate family members included. You're looking at spouses, children, stepchildren, parents, grandparents, grandchildren, siblings, first cousin, nieces, nephews, aunts, and uncles. So you're getting pretty far out in the family spectrum. And always the question comes, how do we control, what other people in the family are doing? The one that comes to mind mostly on this was back a couple years ago when Marty Chavez was mayor, and his wife was a realtor and very active in developing, and selling and developing property on the west side. Now, is that something where she would be covered by the ethics code as far as any type of conflict of interest would go? And I know that we had a lot of back when they were developing the west side. In those days, we had a lot of criticism in the newspaper of Margaret Chavez doing work that might be in conflict with the city itself because the city was looking at putting infrastructure out for development on the west side. So I don't think anything ever came of it or went to the board, but again, these are issues that you're going to have to look at, and they are issues that are duties are given to you as board members, because very often, particularly in real estate or in contracting, city contractors, as far as building projects, building roads, and other city infrastructure. You may have a family member who's in business and where it is very much connected to the city, and the goal is that they are included in the trying to prevent a conflict of interest to a family member as well as to the employee or candidate themselves. So what is covered by the Code of Ethics, which is mostly, let me just read it. The Ethics Code covers officials and the gifts they receive, contracts and pre-contracts, bids, proposals they are involved in, or financial interests that they own, if any of these are affected by government activities or actions. So it's really looking at financial. It's not looking at what somebody may do in their personal life. It's not if somebody would get arrested or get a DWI. That kind of activities are not covered. It's really having to do financially with the city and making sure there's not a conflict and making sure there's full disclosure. Again, I'm going on to page 3. The finances are included as gifts, tangible, intangible goods and services, promises, even plants and flowers. So, of course, this comes out to my thinking. What if somebody asked you to lunch? What if I'm an attorney with the city, I'm sitting out with opposing counsel, we finally make settle something, and invite me out to lunch. Or somebody's coming to ask questions and they invite you out to lunch. I don't know how far this goes, but it looks like it covered just about anything. But again, a lot of it's common sense as well, that going out to lunch or being taken to lunch with somebody is not really going to impair your judgment on it, as opposed to something major. Contracts are pretty self-explanatory, as buying, selling, doing business with the city, or even renting real property. That's included financial interests and or interests in partnerships, corporations with the official or their immediate family members own 10% or more of the capital stock, worth more than $25,000, or in which an official is the officer, director, or agent, including direct interests and indirect interests as a trustee or representative. So there's a financial component and a percentage of ownership component, and it looks like the two of them have to be met. Okay, so what must officials do under the Code of Ethics? Well, again, I've talked about disclosure. Officials must disclose financial interests in pending matters to the governing body. If the city is looking at buying a building that's owned by a member of the city council or the mayor or an official here, that has to be disclosed. And then councilors need to disclose direct or indirect interests in pending matters, which will disqualify them from voting. It's very often if you see city council meetings, you see a counselor has to get up and leave because they may have a financial interest in what's going on. We have a lot of realtors that run for city council, and so they often have this type of a conflict of interest, where they may have a piece of property that's owned by them, owned by a family member, owned by a client. And so there are conflict of interest problems, and generally one way they could abstain from the vote, but it's much easier just to walk out and leave and not even know about it or have any comments on it. It's kind of, you're trying to go not only not to do anything improper, but to avoid the appearance of impropriety. And so very often the council will leave a meeting when they're voting on a particular subject or transaction which they or their clients or relative would have an interest. They have to make quarterly financial statements. That's for the mayors and councilors, and that really has to do with campaign contributions that are paid or expenditures that are made. And make annual statements showing changes or additions to disclosure at the time the candidacy is declared. Again, that is a general financial statements that have to be made. What must officials not do under the Code of Ethics? Well, you can't disclose or use confidential information about city government or affairs or property to directly or indirectly advance the official's own financial or private interests or that of family members. It's similar to insider trading. Certainly you don't want the public or an official to take advantage of their position if they know something before everybody else does. Again, once the information becomes public, it's a different story, because then you're all on similar grounds. But certainly you don't want that official to be able to use information that they get from their work in order for their financial advantage at the expense of the public or expense of other people. Again, they're not to vote or participate in negotiating city contracts if they have a direct or indirect financial interest in the contract. Again, examples are construction contracts, real estate transactions. Represent private interests proceeding or any appeal of city decisions. And that seemed to come up mostly as I've seen over the years here in counselors or their family in real estate and in real estate transactions. Accept a gift from a city employer applicant. Or for city employment or from anyone involved in business dealings with the city. Misuse of government property or funds for an official's personal gain. Luckily, it wasn't a city, but I do remember a number of years ago, somebody from the county having a contractor doing work from the county, who's doing work for the county, doing work on their personal residence. And you don't know if anything was wrong or not. I mean, they don't know. You weren't able to really tell whether he was getting a discount, whether the contractor was doing it for free because he got the county contract, but it looked bad. And that would be something that could be subject to an investigation. As I said, the perception of the appearance of impropriety is really important and something that you often have maybe called on to investigate and to clear up one way or the other. And the other sections just have to do with campaigning, using city property to promote a campaign, or using city resources, including city-owned communications, signage, websites, or email for campaigning. I also remember during my tenure with the city about, and I don't think it was an ethics complaint or not, but certainly in the paper, about a city official using city email to organize with other city people and outside the city their campaign. Again, you're using a city facility for your personal gain, and that's really what we're trying to prevent. Any unfair advantage that you may use by using city facilities. What else may a city councilor not do under the code? Well, he can't be a city employee or an appointee paid position within city government. I saw in the paper this morning that the Court of Appeals came down with a decision that somebody in the fire department could not run for state legislature. I guess they had already been on state legislature while the case was on appeal because they had won in district court. But again, you're trying to keep the city employees from, in that case, from going into the state legislature. And in this case, you don't want, the charter says a city employee shall not be an elected official in city government. And a voter debate on a matter will likely result in his or her benefit greater than employed by the general public. Again, is not using a position with the city for personal gain. Okay, so when an official can be disqualified from voting or participating in an official action is when that official has a direct interest in an enterprise affected by the vote, when the official benefits directly or indirectly with a person who has an interest in the enterprise affected by the official vote, when the official benefits financially from a direct interest or relationship with a person lobbying for a vote or other official actions. Again, it includes lobbyists. When an official solicits or accepts a loan from a person who would be affected by an official action. So loans are included in financial interests. Lobbyists are considered when you're talking about financial interests. So I think and the other section will be on the election code.
Do we have, are you aware of any ethical complaints that have been heard by the board?
I'm not aware directly. I'm aware that they had some complaints before, I don't think the last election, but maybe the election before, that were lodged by the opponent in the election. And if I remember correctly, they were shown to be frivolous, but they just came out a couple days before. And therefore, there wasn't any time for the board to act on them anyway. But that's really the only ones that I'm aware of. Yeah, ethical complaints, not disclosing campaign contributions, not disclosing expenditures.
Well, yeah, I mean, we deal with those, the non-disclosures, the financial statements for the campaigns, but I'm thinking more of an actual ethical complaint.
Not that I remember.
Conflicts of interest or whatever.
Not what I remember. It was mostly campaign financing. And as I said, usually within a week or two of the election. So you can get the smear out, but not necessarily have to justify it or have that candidate claim considered to be, and whether the claim is good or bad. But that's the only ones I've heard of it that I'm aware of, and that goes back a couple elections. But there were a bunch of them came out at the end.
I think we get those every election
Mhm.
cycle. There will be complaints filed that so-and-so, my opponent, hasn't filed his proper paperwork, or he's not disclosing all the receipts and expenditures. But I was thinking more of, the typical ethical issues that we just went through.
Right. Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if anybody else is aware of any of those or not. Okay. Well, let me talk about the election code, because that's the second section of the charter, which talks about the duties of the Board of Ethics and Campaigns. So who is covered by the election code? First of all, the candidate themselves, runs for mayor or city council. Candidates' finance committees. The candidate is required to have one treasurer who is named on on the campaign materials. When you hear the election ads, you always say, and they have a name of somebody as a treasurer, and that's usually on the bottom of any of the brochures that go out, and should be. That's the finance committee, also the candidate's treasurer. And a measure finance committee being the political committee that's financing any campaign. So what is covered by the election code? It's for the campaign practice of the candidates, as well as the measure finance committees. And it not only covers general elections for people running for office, it covers elections for issues that are coming before the voters by the direct initiatives. We had a number of those over the last couple of years. I hadn't seen that before the last several years, but we've had 2 or 3 that have actually, I think about 3, that we've actually had direct voter initiatives. And what is covered by the election code, I think you're talking about campaign materials. That's the printed materials. Ones that get mailed, the people pass out on corners. Really what's written, and also the telephone transmission, used by the candidate or by the finance committee. I assume that also includes when you, around elections, when you get the robocalls and the automatic voice messages, vote for me, or vote for, this is, somebody vote for this particular candidate. Okay. It also covers contributions. Again, includes loans, debts incurred, as well as actual cash contributions. I found it interesting when I talked about anonymous donors. They had a very specific code on provision on anonymous donors that, according to the charter, the candidate can't keep anonymous gifts. They have to turn it over to the city treasury or to a charity that they pick, but they have to disclose them. So you can get your campaign contributions through your political action group or your the measured finance committee, but not which makes another layer of who actually gave the gifts, what individual, what company, but it's not anonymous donors. And expenditures are also included. So it's really the finance part of a campaign. What must a candidate do under the election code? Well, the first thing they have to do is submit a declaration of their candidacy and disclosures. The first initial disclosure form requires a lot of information. It requires the sources of income, kind of jobs. It also, I thought interesting, it requires a disclosure of organizations that you are involved in and serve as an officer or on the board. And I think that's given so that the voters can get more of a background on somebody. just trying to think of maybe a hot issue. I mean, if you have somebody that's on Planned Parenthood or somebody that's on the Right to Life committees, that's something that the people who wrote the charter think that the public ought to know. And so that will be in the disclosures, and it will be available for the public in the clerk's office. And, very likely something that the newspaper who has access to that information is going to acquire, and something that the charter requires a candidate to disclose.
So, one of the things came up the other day, one of the candidates was filling out a form, and it says professional organizations, and he was trying to think to make sure he put everything down, and then he said, oh, I'm a member of the Masons, and he said, but that's not a professional organization. Should that be divulged or not? He decided not to, thinking, and I'm not that familiar with the Masons,
Mm-hmm.
but would that be something he should disclose? And now that I
That's a
know
good
where-
one because it's kind of in the gray area.
Okay.
Not being a professional organization such as myself as a member of the Bar Association, and that also may have a bearing on the other examples that I gave, being more of a personal rather than organization rather than professional organization. But I think that I don't know whether you want to err on the side of disclosure or not, but those are the tough questions that they have to figure out.
So what's my responsibility as the city clerk? I mean, now knowing this, do I let the board know? Should I have directed him to put it on anyway? I mean, or do I?
And it's hard for you to make that call,
Right.
too. That's it may be a question for the board, or maybe a question that you need to call our office and try to get an opinion.
Okay.
Advisory opinion?
Advisory opinion. The board could give an advisory opinion on that, and that is the perfect kind of. And that really is the perfect kind of question I can see. Something in the gray area where people are trying to do the right thing. But again, you won't get a really quick answer if you have to get an advisory opinion. But certainly we can
Err on the
give it a
side
try.
of disclosure. I mean, that's my own.
I think that is the best advice, is err on the side of disclosure, because that is the intent, is to get all the information out to the public and to let them know as much as they can about the candidates, about their income, and this is the only thing that I've seen really in the candidates other than financial arrangements, just by disclosure or prohibitions. When they get into your personal organizations, what kind of work you do, where you get your income from. But this is the only thing I've seen outside of that general realm of disclosure or prohibitions of activities when dealing with the city. Okay, so they've probably gone over the rest of the other ones previously. Source of income, present business relationship with the city. Again, certainly the voters are entitled to know if somebody has a massive building contract with the city, if they're building the next major building or streets or anything like that, and they have some kind of financial interest dealing with the city. The voters are entitled to know, and that will be information that's readily available. And finally, all real estate that owned in Bernalillo County. As I said, most of the financial dealing with the city that I've seen are either by contractors or by real estate. Okay, campaign finance management. The candidate must establish no more than one candidate finance committee and appoint a treasurer who's not the candidate. You're trying to go to a single source that you can go to for your information. Establish one and only one bank account, deposit all campaign contributions in that account, and place on file with the bank this signed letter authorizing the board to inspect the candidate's bank records. So if you have if you have disclosure questions, the board can request and has pre-authorization to look at the bank records. Okay, what are the financial disclosures? total contributions received, whether deposited in the campaign's bank account or not, which I found kind of interesting because that conflicts with establishing one and only one bank account. But that's in the charter that if you're taking contributions that are not in the bank account, then you have to make that additional disclosure. To name each individual contributor, the name and address of every entity that's a contributor, and the amounts of each contribution. I think I talked about anonymous donors, which seems to have a prohibition about accepting anonymous donations for campaigns. Disclosure of expenses, again, all the income, all the expenses that are used in the campaign. Disclosure of contracts. On Section 3, I think that each candidate shall disclose all contributions of contracts with the employer of a candidate if the candidate was not responsible in any way for the recommendation of the was responsible in any way for the recommendation of the award of the contract. And they use a $20,000 figure on the contract. It includes employers, and this particular disclosure is required to go on the website. Some other disclosures go on the website. This one is required to go on the website as far as dealings with the city. Then schedule of reports, and that has to do with the campaign income and expenses that have to be filed with the city clerk's office, and then again available to the public. I think that one goes on the website. That one, finance records go on the website as well. And then they have to disclose or keep a record and file with the clerk all campaign materials by them or by their sponsor, and that's really for an independent review if required by the board. Measure finance committees do have similar requirements, and again, they very similar to a campaign or an individual. Okay, what must campaign candidates not do under the election code? They can't accept contributions. Well, again, a lot of this has been overturned by court decision. So what we did in this is we took the provisions from the charter, and then we, starting on page 7, we took the provisions of the charter that have been overruled by court decisions. So at least you would have the resource to know that is on the books, but also know it's been overturned. And that's how the first and second section of materials tie together. What we did was we gave you both the summary that I'm going over and then the source materials. So we have a reference to where you can find it, and we copied the 3 sections of the charter that have to do with the campaign finance, with the Board of Ethics jobs, and overseeing officials and overseeing candidates. So the campaign contributions limitations were overruled in Homans versus City of Albuquerque. And you said it was 2001. Do you remember what position Rick Homans had run for? I can't remember if it was a mayor or a state job. Mayor. It was a mayor? And he spent an awful lot of money. And he said, and he argued in court that his expenditures was part of his right to free speech, that he could spend as much money as he wanted to get his publicity out, get his message across on TV and in print. And the courts agreed with him. And so they took away, much in line with what we've seen in the federal government, they also took away campaign limits, campaign expenditure limits.
So just to be clear, the individual limits still are maintained, but the cumulative contribution limits
I believe that's correct. So, Section 3 talks about contributions of any one person, and it shows a limit on that. But what the person can spend themselves doesn't go into the limits. Is that right? I think that's correct, Eric. Okay.
So tell me where you are. You're looking at the charter, right?
I am on page 7 of the materials. We're going on to the charter on the election materials. Let me get the right page for you. I can find
So
it.
it's those pages with the red?
Yeah.
Yeah, the red.
Okay.
The red are overruled.
The red are overruled.
Yeah.
Well, we
the
want-
red, and the italics are the commentary
Mhm.
about what the cases were that overrules. And the black means it wasn't overruled, so it's pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Color coding.
But we want to give you both the charter provision and it being overruled, so that if somebody asks you about it, you can make have the information there. Because I hate to have a call and say, well, this has been overruled by a court ruling and it's no good anymore. Well, but it's still in the charter, and I think that'll give you the answer to those questions. The second was no candidate shall accept contributions from any corporation, limited liability company, firm, partnership, or joint stock company or similar business entity. Again, that is overruled by a court decision. And of course, the big U.S. Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, that's cited, was where that was where the political action committee limits spending limits were overruled by the U.S. Supreme Court. So some are overruled, some aren't. Now you still have the ban on contribution who had contractual relations. The ban on individual contributions. And the last section, D, is publicly financed candidates with matching funds. I think that's been overruled too. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Okay. I think that probably Nick's going to go over about enforcement, but you can there is enforcement. The board has a right to get an accountant to look at finances. They have a right to get an investigator. You can either use the city process, but you don't have to. The city process usually calls for RFPs, requests for proposals, and competitive bids, which will probably take longer than it will probably take for the investigation. But the process is available, but investigators are available. Or you can use the internal process of our independent investigator, the city's IG's office. A private, going back down to section 12, a private citizen may initiate a charge of violation, and the board would hold a hearing. It could hold a hearing at that point if they choose to. The board may make a public reprimand or impose a fine of up to $500. And it can also go to council to recommend to suspend or remove an official or council member. Any decision by the board can be appealed and heard by the district court. And I think I said before, and I'll say it again, that the courts are very strict on making sure the rules are followed and that you have a reasonable result. They usually don't second guess their opinion for that of elected officials and a board. I think the election code has similar provisions as far as complaints. They need to be specific about an alleged violation. The board has to provide the candidate with a notice of any charges are made. The board may investigate. The board can have a hearing. And upon the failure to file disclosures, there is a mandatory fine that has to be levied. And a lot of that's covered in the board's own rules and regulations. I just want to make one more comment before I finish. And I don't know if you have, is Tony over here? If you have, well, I may read this. This is the only thing one thing I ran on PowerPoint. But back in, what you're doing has really been backed and is a trend with the City Council. Back in May of this year, the City Council passed a resolution in connection with their 5-year plan that they do, and they try to divide that into 1-year objectives to implement the overall long-term 5-year objectives. And I want to read to you what they passed and approved 9-0 in May. As far as the objective on government excellence and effectiveness, it says government is ethical, transparent, and responsive to its citizens. Every element of government contributes effectively to the meeting of the public needs. And to implement that policy, they came up with this objective. Implement a comprehensive ethics training program for city officials to include elected officials and executive and senior staff in order to reaffirm that the city is dedicated to fostering an environment of fairness and accountability in all of its dealings. Provide the mayor and city council with a report on the status of the program by the end of the second quarter of fiscal year 16. So the city council has actually mandated that the administration and our office have a program to talk to elected officials about ethics. And your job is to oversee that program to make sure that any complaints are properly considered and fairly dealt with. Okay. I don't know if you have any questions, and I've answered some of them. Some I can answer, some I can't, but I'll take a shot at them, or any of us can.
Yeah,
Sure,
here
Rex.
on the materials that you gave us, it says the total contributions from one person can't exceed $875, at least for this election.
For city
And
council.
that's is
for
that the
council.
City council, or is that the mayor?
That's council.
Council.
That's
Council.
council only.
Council. So what about the mayor? What would be the limitation?
Isn't it a percentage of his salary?
It's 5% of the salary for the office which the candidate is running for. So it would be significantly higher than the council cap. And in this election, we only have council seats that are up for election. So it'd be 5% of the mayor's salary.
So it's $875 for the council, and if they opt for public financing, that's like $1 a vote. And how much, what would that amount to? Just generally, because they would vary from district to district.
Actually, if you remember offhand, I don't know. It does vary because it's actually based on registered voters.
Yeah, is it-
So there is, even though the population is very similar in every single district, the number of registered voters varies significantly, but it is a dollar match per registered voter as provided from the Bernalillo County, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's $1 per registered voter from the district.
Right.
Just ballpark, how much
Oh.
would that be for a
I don't know.
Does anybody recall offhand?
I can check that out, Rex, to tell
Yeah.
you what it was this last time,
Mhm.
and I'll look on the website right now.
Okay.
Have candidates that are running this time for city council, have they opted for public financing?
Two of them, I know you did, Councilor Benson, and there was another one who opted. We have it all on our website, it's for everybody to see all of it.
And I put 3 sections from the charter in the materials. I talked a lot about 11 and 12, which are basically the ethics for officials, and also the ethics of campaign financing. But the third part, and the only other part of the charter that mentions the Board of Ethics, is the last section, number 16, Open and Ethical Election Code. And only the last section of the Open and Ethical Election Code involves the Board of Ethics, but again, it's on page 36, the very last part of the materials, and it just says the Board of Ethics and Campaign Practices shall enforce the Open and Ethical Election Code pursuant to Articles 12 and 13. So that Section 16 has to deal with the public financing of campaigns, and so basically the duties of the board encompass administering that public financing. The other portion of the mention of the Board of Ethics in the statutes I also put on page 37, And that just talks about the availability of the Inspector General to assist the board if requested in investigations. So again, the board can either use the city internal investigations office, or you can go outside the city if you want to. Okay. Oh. Yeah, go ahead and talk about some of these.
Well, it was answering Mr. Throckmorton's question about the
This is interesting.
Okay.
Go ahead and talk about the complaints that we've had and the kind of thing you can expect to deal with.
So Natalie and Trina helped me yesterday just get a random flavor of what the complaints that have come up. And so to answer your question, Mr. Throckmorton, about have there ever been complaints under the ethics code, and I saw a couple, and this is extremely random, but they're very closely related to campaigns, even though they're against public officials. So there was one in which the complaint was that the public official who was running for office was using emails to tout the public official's accomplishments. So normally a public official may do that, but under, I believe, Section 5 has brought the code for 3 months before the election, you're not allowed to do that, so that there would be a is that clear? So that no one will mistake status report from a public official for campaign material. So that's why there's that rule. And so there was a complaint about a public official who had violated that rule. And that rule is actually in the ethics code about misuse of public property. And the other one was against a public official who had accepted campaign contributions from contractor, a city contractor. And
Come up with context of an election.
yeah, that's when people get hot and heavy, I guess. Yeah, they get, that's when the adrenaline's running. But they were, so you're going to be facing that. Mr. Throckmorton, I'm sure you're used to it, but a lot of feverish activity, high emotions. But they were the subject of actual complaints to the board that the board considered. But the ones that I saw all resulted in summary dismissal. So, those are dismissals at a preliminary hearing level that the complaint did not state, like a motion to dismiss in court, a failure to state a claim, right? So I just wanted to answer your question. But, I saw 6 of these. That's pretty random. I didn't have that much time. One of them, this is interesting. I'll mention this person's name because I guess he's somewhat, well known. His name is a photographer named Mr. Brawley. Filed a complaint against Mayor Chavez during a campaign period because Mayor Chavez allegedly took a photograph of mine. In other words, he's a photographer, and so he had it posted on a website. And used it in his campaign materials, even though Mr. Brawley billed him. Mayor Chavez did not pay. So guess what happened to that complaint?
So we're in the collections business.
That one is very aptly dismissed for failure to state a claim. There is nothing in the either codes talking about that. So anyway, let's see what else. those are the, oh, and then, this is kind of interesting. Okay, no, this is, I think that there must be probably a number of complaints, probably Trina knows her, and maybe Natalie, that have to do with failure to disclose campaign expenditures or campaign contributions. So I have one of those here. But that one got dismissed, too. All the ones I have were dismissed. The this one is these. Oh, and then under the ethics, Bob wanted me to mention this. Under the ethics code of ethics, I saw at least a couple of complaints against the city police department, and those were dismissed because they were acting unethically, and those are also not really covered by the ethics code, and so they were dismissed. That they were using excessive force, and so they may be legitimate complaints, but this is not the forum to bring them to. And actually, I did see a couple of those in the file cabinet, and mentioned it to Bob, and he said, well, you can mention that as something that you might see anyway, even though we know it's not germane. And then I saw a couple on measure finance committees. And this is interesting, and one of these, over this period of time, an individual became a large contributor to a measure finance committee, and this person failed to, or the committee failed to put this person's name in the name of the MFC, and so somebody filed a complaint against that, and that one was going towards settlement because the committee chairperson looked at what had happened and indeed failed to update the materials, the campaign materials, after receiving this contribution. So that's an example of how these complaints can be resolved, and I believe that Nick is going to be talking about that because the settlement process is one section of the rules and regulations. And then in this other one, this is an MFC also. Oh, okay, so this is, well, I have to mention who it is for it to make any sense, but this is the committee that was campaigning for either the certain minimum wage or a working, what do they call that, living wage. So this committee failed to register altogether. Sometimes people who are activists, and I support that people are activists in our community and they should do that, but they may not know all the rules, so they didn't know to register. And so there was a complaint filed against them. On by the way, on the penalty, the automatic penalty for failure to disclose that applies to the mayor and councilors, there's a 10-day cure rule, so that the automatic penalty triggers if they fail to file their disclosure statements after being notified. They have a 10-day period to cure. So yeah. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. Next time I'll do a little more research.
The public financing, we had 3 candidates this year, and one received about $46,000, the other $39,000, and the other about $37,000. So they get $5 contributions from 1% of the registered voters, and that's what they bring in that we put into the coffers, and then they get this back. And they have to be registered voters in their district.
one second. I was sitting here thinking about one of your questions, too, about about any complaints against elected officials. And I do remember one during the time I was here when former Mayor Chavez took his wife on one of his business trips, and she was paid, she was paid a public expense for airfare, and I do remember that I think it was the board that actually reprimanded him and fined him, I think, $500. But that's the only one I can think of the years I've been here.
So I guess that's a good thing, right?
Well, it's an example of what comes up, and I believe it went into a recommendation to council, and then council imposed a reprimand and fine.
No, I meant that there weren't that many that
Yeah.
you can remember, so that I think is a good thing. So do you want to take a break and open this up here?
I think it'd be probably a good time to take about a 20-minute break. Would that be good? So everybody can maybe get refreshments or whatever.
I think 10 might be enough.
10's enough? Okay, that's fine, if we get through 10 minutes.
Okay, so let's put this out.
I need to go get my paper bag. No, I'll be right back.
Okay. Bob, thank you for giving it. And I hope that I was sure when I do.
No, you did all the work.
Oh, no, but, okay, I'm glad you felt how I made a contribution, because you were so much better than I could have done, because you have all the experience and the stories.
I've seen some of it.
Stories make it come alive.
I remember when Mayor Chavez got.
Yeah,
And I tried to go about an hour, so I hope that was about right
yeah,
for these guys.
yeah.
They'll probably go have more peripheral.
So anyway, when I was down here with Tony, the IT person showed us how to put it up here, and I think Eric wants to put it up here.
Good.
But maybe if Tony's around,
Oh, he's here.
is he around?
He was out here before.
Thank you guys so much.
I hope I didn't bore you with it, but
No,
it's
I'm
pretty dry
interested
material.
in this, but it's all, I mean, new for me, and
We're learning on the fly to real estate.
I think it's great. And you know what? So Dan Lewis, Councilor Lewis, is proposing, are you guys involved in that training?
Not
He's
yet, but that was what I
proposing?
was talking about. That's the resolution also.
Yeah, I heard you say that, and I was over at Public Service University before I got this job, and one of the employees there was saying that they wanted to, that the counselor's office approached him about putting it online, on the learning management system that's available. So I just wanted to make sure you all were involved in the content. It sounds like
we
they're
talked
already
about it.
moving.
Not really. We kind of talked about it over the last couple of days, and that's about it.
Okay.
Because it's similar to this, but not the same.
Right, and I saw some things, well, we'll be doing IFRA, which I think is important
IFRA,
for them. Open
Open
Meetings Act is important. And even some of these other things, like not accepting gifts. And the whole thing about your family members, I didn't realize that. How do you control, your
I know.
crazy Uncle Ed?
Okay, I'm going to date myself. Right, exactly. What was Carter's brother? Billy. Brother Billy. Who kept getting him a Jew, who kept opening the big mouth and getting Carter in trouble. I remember that was in school. And so, he's covered.
That is so funny.
I want to look more into the thing about what you're asking. I think, just jump on this city that says that no instructional board is effective until approved.
Yeah, you guys can, for sure. Okay.
How to match up the chords. I know that this goes here. If Tony's around. Do you know how to work it? I changed it to Podium PC, right? But I couldn't find this one. Which one is that?
That's the internet.
Oh, I don't need it then.
You don't need the internet.
Oh, well, it's up.
It's up, yeah.
Okay. See, I think it's, I'm always so worried it's more complicated than it is. Thank you, Tony.
And you got Eric's?
This is
This is
Eric's.
Eric's?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
You got it. Beautiful.
I'm gonna go get my lunch. Yeah, real. I haven't eaten since last night. Where'd Bob go? Oh, he's down. Eric. Eric was upstairs.
longer history than the rest of us here.
Well, I can answer some of the
Yeah.
questions.
We don't maybe have as much as you, the city is Trinidad. She's been here.
I was thinking, I remember when Lonnie Chavis, the council took him to task. That's the only one I ever remember. No, it wasn't the adverse person in the campaign, claiming a few days before the election. Look at my opponent's stuff.
Yeah, Doris didn't drink it.
Oh, really? Well,
She just said, "Oh, those hearings get lively." That was like a big thing.
yeah. I sat on a part of one, I think, while Amy Bailey was still here. Well, actually, they did that because they, well, they wanted to know what Mr. Gray was doing. And so I did that. It's good. But it's surprising that it's done that. It's weird that they get that.
What you guys are next?
Actually, he's last because he's got the law. That's the.
And their rules and regs, which you kind of just find
Yeah.
points for what you are.
So he's going to be like the finale.
Well, I really thought when we put this together, that's something that kind of new and emerging and something that board members need to know.
Oh, yeah.
Hi. Your question?
Quick question, because we were discussing it on the break, and that is that we've got an election coming up. We have almost 5 board members appointed as opposed to 6.
Mhm.
And we're wondering whether or not the 5 board members can take action to appoint a chair. And whether it's a quorum thing or it must be all 6 appointments filled with time. And so maybe that might be something you guys to look at.
Yeah, I think we'll have to probably get with Natalie, and also I think a lot of it would depend on how quickly you can get that 6th person. And so we'll find out on that.
Okay, because I'm not sure if there's been a competition. There's at least for the last 5. But,
Okay. Okay. We'll follow that up, definitely. So I guess we're about ready to start again?
Do we have any complaints yet?
Not yet. Is that true? No. No. I'm,
Everybody's perfect.
I like to think so. We think, there we go. Just want to get my materials here. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Oop. What's that from? Oh, something. Oh, that was touching the microphone.
Slides.
There we go. Okay. Yep, I'll do it. Okay, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Eric Locher, last name Locher. I've been with the City Legal Department since 2009. I've been advising the City Clerk's office since October of last year. This will be the first general election, or city election, with candidates that I will be involved with, and so it's going to be interesting. We actually did one election earlier this year. It's called a PID board election. That's a public improvement district, and that was interesting because it involved property-based voters as well as registered voters in the districts having the right to vote, and there's proportional voting, so that got very interesting. I had to get our calculators out. So it was something new. It was the first time that we had those elections, and I think we did pretty well. We didn't get any complaints. So, all right. Well, I'm here today mostly to focus on the Inspection of Public Records Act. Pretty much everyone talks about it every day around here. We call it IPRA. It's the short version of it. And basically it does have an impact on almost everything we do at the city, whether that be administration, council, or the boards, the public boards that you serve on, because your actions are as officials and on behalf of the city as well. So nearly everything that you'll be involved with will be subject to this act. There are some exceptions, and we'll discuss those. Let me go ahead and get started with the PowerPoint. Okay. The statute's pretty self-explanatory. It's Article 14, subsection 2-1 in the state statutes. That is our law is statutory. There are a few cases that give some guidance to it, but pretty much we strictly follow the statute, and the interpretation of it is pretty much on its face. The Attorney General, though, has issued a guide that gives some advice that goes beyond the statute, because there are so many areas this impacts that, and basically there's what I would call advisory opinions on certain situations, and that guide is very useful. You can download that. I don't have a copy of that in your materials, but you can download that from the Attorney General's office in a PDF electronically and a print. And that has been most recently updated this year by Attorney General Balderas. The other thing we have to comply with it as well is the administrative instruction, but that is the city's own guide. It's 1-7, and I can actually email that to you all, as well as the Attorney General guide that I referenced. That goes into more detail about our policies and procedures that aren't covered by the statute and how we actually get into the mechanics of receiving and responding to an IPA request. It gives some of the details that helps the requester know what to expect, as well as each department and how they should specifically handle records. And at this, the last bullet here is about the city clerk's regulations and procedures. The city clerk is the lead custodian of the records and our chief for the whole city. So if there's something that is among several departments, or there's a question or disagreement, it tends to go to the city clerk's office. Everybody gets to weigh in, but at that point, the city clerk would, issue some policies or maybe update the instruction. The administrative instruction has been drafted generally by the city clerk's office with the legal department, and then ultimately the chief administrative officer would approve any updates or new instructions. Each department, also just to go back to that bullet there, each department has its own records custodian, and so they will handle directly requests from the public that only pertain to their department. It's also everybody's responsibility to share with the city clerk or the other departments that they're pretty sure is a department that needs to respond to that request. And the mission statement is about open and transparency. That is the policy of the administration. And so as a default, the city, the answer is yes before no, or should this be released, rather than should it not be released. There are exceptions, but the default is assuming, without looking at the entire statute, that it is a public record, and that's part of the policy of openness and transparency. It's a very technical act, the language, but it doesn't talk about policy. But if you read the whole act, it definitely invokes, the general principle that the public and also, the citizens, as well as other members of the government and other governments, have the right to know as much as possible about government affairs and the official acts of public officers, which include your convening as a board, and the employees. And part of that is it's for accountability, of course, and for people to have the information they need about what the government is doing and what those responsibilities are. A custodian, as I said, the city clerk's office is the chief custodian of records. Each department has its own custodian. Any or all of those custodians may respond to an IPA request. Also, any persons that have access to that information may directly disclose it, as long as that's something that is part of what is in their department, and normally they would do that in conjunction with their custodian of records, if, for example, it was APD or Parks and Recreation and so forth. Some records are not in paper. That's fine. The state doesn't require us to make a document into something that different than what it is already. So if we can provide something electronically, we do, and that also increases efficiency and cuts down cost. There's actually two parts. It's the right to inspect. A lot of people believe it always involves getting copies. The requester can ask for copies, but it isn't required to. Inspections are always at no cost. There are exceptions in terms of if the city has to prepare the records in such a way that would require redaction or making copies, that can be an exception to that. But then the person will be notified up front as to what records might require that type of work. A person is any individual corporation, partnership, or entity. And also we need to throw in there other governments. So if the state of Colorado wants to have information from the city of Albuquerque, it can be requested. So can the county, Bernalillo County, the state of New Mexico. So those are examples of IPRA in action. Public body. What this gets at is IPRA covers the actual work and the duties of the public body itself, the business that is charged to do, whether that be city council passing legislation, the mayor overseeing all the departments, making sure things are functioning properly. So anything germane to the city's business is generally a public record. City records can be a lot of things. If you go to our planning department, you'll find enormous documents sometimes, maps, diagrams, that type of thing. And generally speaking, a public record is anything that is used, created, received, and or maintained, held by on behalf of the public body. So a good example of what it is and isn't a public record would be, for example, I choose to organize myself with my cell phone. So that's my personal cell phone, but I use it to organize myself, but that wouldn't be a public document or record. Now, on the other hand, email that I send to and from it may be a public record if it's not eternally client privileged. So that would be the same as if I send an email from my desktop to someone that isn't the city or my client. So attorney emails generally aren't public records if they're discussing with their clients. My client is the city clerk or the administration. But they are if it goes outside the city or to someone else. So correspondence between the city and other individuals is a public record. Unusual circumstances. Okay. Sometimes we get requests that are just very difficult to respond to quickly. There are very short time frames. The government is supposed to give a response within 3 days of acknowledging the request and or providing the records. And if they are not able to provide the records, they are to give a time frame in which they anticipate it. And in this example, if somebody just comes in and says, I want every email in the last 5 years for a particular public official, it would actually take, first of all, it would have to be determined whether or not that could be searched, how far back, depending on what our database is. But even so, at that point, it would have to be reviewed before inspection because there may be exceptions, including attorney-client opinion, things to do with law enforcement investigations that are not currently charged. So things that are, for example, our APD detectives sometimes work a case for weeks, months, or even years to determine what appropriate action should be taken. Until that's turned over to the DA, those things are generally not part of the public domain. Okay, I talked about the chief custodian. So the city clerk and her assistant, Kathleen Oney, actually drafted this presentation, and I helped her with the latest revisions. Sets the guidelines for all records custodians. So coordinating them, training, and also making sure that everybody is as consistent as possible with how they're handling these requests. There is a link on the city website to actually go ahead and make an email request, and that's going to be updated fairly soon. By the end of the month, there's actually going to be a whole new system called Next Request, which will be a software program dedicated entirely for public records. And everybody's pretty excited about it because currently we're doing things the old-fashioned way, emails, calls, letters. That will be our one-stop place to track these items and make sure that we have everything disclosed that we need to on time. And the city attorney's office is involved both with the departments and city clerk in advising on a regular basis. A very typical area where legal gets involved is anything to do with records request on personnel files. Personnel files generally aren't excluded from IPRA in their entirety, but there are portions that are, which include personal contact information. Something that would be entirely exempt would be, for example, a psychological evaluation, because that falls under medical and HIPAA privacy. Some of these things, it may be different if there were a lawsuit and discovery rules. That might require other things to be disclosed, but if it's simply a request and it's not litigation, there are certain protected things, and that includes also opinions about employees' performance. However, the final action is disclosed to the public and can be produced, so the part that isn't an opinion has been produced, and the prior city attorney did issue a memo on that. So that part is a public record, and it's definitely allowed to be inspected. Okay. We call them DRCs, or departmental record custodians, and the city clerk is the lead, with Kathleen Oney being under the city clerk being the custodian who also directs other departments. It's important, of course, to have backups. We have backups in every department because people obviously take vacations, and with those strict guidelines, deadlines, if there's any time out, we don't want to miss anything. Some of the duties include responding to the request, whether it's a fax, email, or letter. Probably the vast majority come to us as an email. It is acceptable and even preferred to respond in the same way, unless the requester in the city agrees to a specific medium. So if it comes in electronically, generally all the communication back to the requester is also through that means. Obviously, the office has to provide a reasonable opportunity to inspect the records. And the city clerk has a number of records that are citywide, and most, if not all, contracts generally are available there. And that's something that includes every department, not just the individual site. Reasonable facilities and hours, so that would be 8 to 5, generally speaking. And then also there should be a posting about what individuals can do and how they request it. And we have a lot of information online, but also there are postings in the city clerk's office. Okay. So we have the clerk who identifies who needs to respond. That can be one department or could be all departments, depending on what it is. Generally, it's 1 to 3 in most cases at the most. And in general, it's important to have only the city clerk or the records custodian to keep in contact with the requester. Sometimes there'll be other people that add to it, but it's important that they are the primary one, because to make sure the communication is clear and that there aren't either multiple requests being responded to and not coordinated, or confusing the requester. All right. So, as I said, any person can request records. It could be a city employee. It could be a member of the public anywhere in the state or anywhere else. They can come and make an appointment to look at records. Second point is interesting. IPRA does require a lot of work in making sure things are available. However, nothing in the Act requires the government to make a record. So if somebody asks for a record that doesn't exist, our standard response is that we don't have a document that's responsive to your request, and then we might state, but you may find information related to X, Y, and Z. So, and sometimes that's often in a request for a certain report that we have the information, but that no specific report has been made on that particular subject, and we'll inform them that, and then direct them to records that might contain the data or information that they want. It isn't, New Mexico is a state that does require a name. There are no anonymous requests. An address, telephone, and email may also be part of the requester's information that they need to provide. So if we get an email or something that doesn't give us any information, and there's no follow-up when we ask for it, that wouldn't be a public records request at that point if they didn't provide that information. This is an interesting issue. One of the things is we talk about is exceptions. One of them is certain aspects of employment records, an ongoing law enforcement investigation, health information that's generally protected under state and federal law. Those are things that should not be disclosed. And that means one of two things, either that the record itself in its entirety shouldn't be disclosed. An example would be a psychological evaluation that was conducted by the HR department, because that would need the permission of the individual, because that's medical information that's protected under state and federal law. So either a court order would be required to release that, directing the city to do it, or the person could choose to release that information. For example, if it's something that is to their own benefit, the employee can give consent to that release to themselves or another party. And this is interesting too. The Act doesn't say why or how. So if somebody's asking for records, our job is to identify what is the records that are responsive to the requests. It's not appropriate for us to ask why. However, we can go in that direction if the requester likes to clarify. So if somebody, gives the purpose for what they're requesting, voluntarily, that is helpful, and most requesters will do that so that we can find what they need. But it isn't proper for us to ask why just because we want to know. Okay. The deadlines are very strict, which is why I said it before that we have backup custodians. There should be a response within 3 days advising whether the records exist, what ones do or do not, and if it will take more time when that would be expected to be completed. And during that time, typically before the 3 days is when the department custodian or the city clerk's custodian go ahead and email all the other ones to make sure that they may or may not have any information that would be responsive to it. And so it's a pretty quick turnaround, and it does require a lot of resources. We are starting to track hours and expenses. For the most part, it is an unfunded mandate from the state. We're required to follow the Act, but there's no funds given to the city to fulfill any of these requests, or regardless of the volume. But it is important for the city to track that, and I think we have established some guidelines. I believe there was a report that set forth how many hours was estimated, as well as the costs. Okay, and then again, this flow chart gives you that deadline, and okay. Again, that goes to, we always want to get out a broadcast net to make sure we don't miss any departments. And if we don't have the records as a city and we know they're somewhere else, we do provide that information. A good example is recently I reviewed a request for the resumes of certain individuals who are UNM employees, and we don't have those records. So we advised that this individual would be best suited to contact the UNM custodian of records, and we gave that information. Okay. And the second part is insufficient. If it's just not clear enough what they want, or it's so broad that it may be difficult to figure that out, we do ask for additional information and give them additional opportunities to clarify that. We respond to oral requests immediately if we can. We sometimes ask individuals to reduce that to writing if it's something that would take more time to go ahead and respond to. Something voluminous, as I said before, would be asking for all the emails of a particular individual or on a particular subject. That could take a lot more time than the deadline, and that would be explained to the requester. And also, if there's sensitive documents that are exempt, that review also can take time. And according to IPRA, the city does need to separate the exempt and the non-exempt documents. And I'll give you an example of exemptions. Again, these can be any type of document, social security numbers. So, for example, when we fill out our employment application or apply for benefits, that information is included, but that would not be disclosed to the public. However, each and every one of our salaries is. That's on a city website. And we'll get to that later, but when we can post the open data, that's the simplest way to comply with the Act, because it's accessible to anyone at any time, and it requires no further action from the city. So if we get a request for the top 5 paid employees by the city, they can actually go to the city website and see that very quickly. And that's what we would do, is just direct them to that. Another example, date of birth is exempt. The year is not, and the court systems also follow this. So if you look up a case in district court about an individual, it may give you a year of birth, but that is it, other than the name. Letters of reference are exempt entirely. Personnel records, they include matters of opinion. So if there's a reprimand or a sanction or an award, those things would be exempt to the extent that they evaluate the employee. The exception, again, would be certain types of litigation or the person themselves consents to releasing that record, whose file that is. And exempt information, this is important too, and I'll get into some details how it applies to you, but if it's entirely exempt, that should be stated why, and also if it's partially exempt, the city should go ahead and remove that information. The old-fashioned way sometimes is what we have to do, and that's just to mark out a copy and then copy it again to make sure it doesn't show through. Okay, so this is an example of a matter of opinion. A city employee tends to get in trouble with their supervisor, has as a result several letters of reprimand in her personnel file. These letters, as well as her annual evaluations, are not subject to disclosure in an IPRA request. However, the factual information in the file, the date hired, any leave taken, any conflicts of interest noted by letter, and the final disposition of a personnel matter is not protected. So the public is always entitled to know whether somebody's employed or not, or if they've been discharged or disciplined and what that action was. The evaluation itself, however, would remain confidential. Okay. And we're going to get what's going to affect you probably the most. Here's an example where there's a large number of records, information on employees hired since 1960. What would probably happen in that case, not only would the requester be informed it's broad and burdensome, but they would be invited to narrow that request as a starting point if they wish. So maybe they would want to start with all the employees who are hired in 2015. Denial, if the records do not exist, I don't really consider it a denial, but the language of the statute does. We have to just inform them that these records do not exist. The names and titles of positions who are responsible for that should be quoted. It must be delivered or mailed within 15 days. Oops, here we go. Normally when the city doesn't do something that it should or did something that was liable for, there aren't attorney's fees allowed. The exceptions are civil rights suits because the federal law provides for attorney's fees. There are very few state causes of action that do allow attorney's fees, and IPRA is one of them. So it is very important for the city to do everything it can to avoid these penalties because they can get steep. There's a $100 a day penalty for not responding to a request after 15 days. There's also attorney's fees that will be awarded if an individual prevails in court. And just more information about our fees. Okay, and so if we're asked to send, for example, records to copy them and send them out of state, we would charge for the copies plus the shipping. The city almost always requires advance payment for anything that requires fees. That avoids a lot of incurring a lot of unnecessary costs. Surprisingly, some individuals make a lot of requests, but then only come in to inspect or maybe some of the requests. So if we had made those copies, it would have been a big waste of resources and time if they just simply abandon the request, which sometimes happens. Okay, and then this is about security. We do only provide electronic records on CD-ROM or DVD-ROM, or if it is a flash drive, it has to come from us, and it has to be new and unused because we can't jeopardize our system by taking other people's electronics and interfacing them with ours. And it's not that necessarily we don't trust the requester. I mean, they could just inadvertently have a virus that goes citywide, and we wouldn't want having to do with that. So, any questions about public records and how it might relate to what you do?
Well, that's my question. So how does it relate to what we do? You mentioned emails.
Mm-hmm.
I assume we create a document in connection with
Mm-hmm.
the business of the board that becomes a public record.
Sure, the meeting minutes.
We don't get involved, the board doesn't get involved in responding to requests for documents.
Mm-hmm. Well, you wouldn't get involved directly, but if we did get a records request for your emails, for example, we would have to work with you to get them. And we do get requests for emails from some of the boards. I would say at least once a month. So it just, part of this is to advise you that, obviously the meeting minutes and the agendas are all public records and they're posted, but also, memos that aren't privileged, things from attorneys giving advice is going to be most likely something that would be disclosed. And Nick's going to get into more detail about the quorum issues, so about being careful not to discuss or debate policies or procedures, policies that are going to be decided outside of a meeting. And one way to avoid that is not to reply to all or have a conversation before the meeting about, what's going to happen or what you think the case might be about. Procedural matters are fine, so for everybody to communicate together, can you meet on this date and that date and so forth, and what should be on the agenda, just a list of the items. But as far as discussing whether or not it's a good, an opinion about how this, case might be decided or the facts that you have so far in an ethics complaint would not be a good thing to put in there. And it could be considered a violation of the Open Meetings Act if there's debate and discussion outside of the open meetings. Is there any other questions?
Are you advising that perhaps we have a separate email account just for the ethics board?
I would recommend that strongly for your convenience as well as, like I said, to make sure that if we do get a request that it wouldn't go into your personal information. So if you do all your city business on one account, it's easy for you to track yourself, and it also would protect you if there's a request so that someone such as our IT department wouldn't have to look at other emails because that does come up, I would say, at least once a month. Yep.
Let me add one more thing. You talked about emails already. This is the first thing that comes to mind. When you use your personal computer at home and communicate with among each other, to each other or to the city. If you take notes at a hearing that you're going to have, that's a public record.
Mm-hmm.
Your personal records or your personal notes as it goes to city business is a public record. And so if you may make a separate folder and just have anything that has to do with city business in one particular place and not intermingled with your own personal things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you don't have to make a record. But
Yep.
if you do have a record, it's subject to open meetings. I'm sorry, it's subject to IPRA.
So if you choose to make a phone call to one person, that would not be IPRA in terms of a written record. Whether you choose to use an email or not is up to you. Obviously, if it's something that helps, email is a good thing, and we all use it. But also at the same time, it's something to consider as far as what responsibility there is to disclose information that is in writing.
I'm sorry, are you saying when you're taking notes in a board meeting and they're cryptic notes to yourself just to help you remind yourself
Yes.
on a legal pad, that would be,
That's exactly what I'm saying.
so someone in the audience don't be taking notes at your request?
Well, they don't have to see if anybody, we get broad requests. Every document of anybody has about this particular case, or sometimes even about all your cases, and all the hearings that you have. So if you make a note, just keep it. If you keep it, you're not required to keep it. You're not required to make a record. But it's a good idea to keep them as long as you're serving on the board. Put them in a separate notebook, so that if the request comes up, you just give the notebook to the city clerk's office, and they'll have it. But then don't intermingle it with personal things.
So how is the police oversight board set up with their emails? Are they using personal accounts, or is that something else? So through the city, because that would be obviously more visible
Yeah.
and more requests through that. So
Yeah,
is there a way to set up email accounts for us and then go to a city server to access and correspond that way, or?
Well, yeah, the city doesn't currently set up for non-city employees. So what ends up happening is it's just up to the individual to choose whatever type of account they want to use, whether it's Yahoo or AOL or Hotmail or any of the choices. But again, we just strongly encourage people to not use their general personal email. And so we don't really have a preference in that regard. But currently, we don't provide city email addresses and accounts to non-employees, and part of that is the personnel rules and some security issues as well. And again, with the security issues, it isn't so much malicious things; it's inadvertent things that can happen with accounts.
So it's our responsibility.
Yes. So you have your own personal choice in how and when and if you do your emails, and the best thing is definitely something separate from your normal account.
One other question, and I think you said that we're not obligated to keep them, but are we allowed to just delete email and stuff, or are we under an obligation to keep the records
Well, I don't know if I can give a complete answer to that. I think you should delete it if it's it's being requested, you should delete it.
No, but as a matter of course, if you get, hey, can you meet this, can we have a meeting this time, this day, that's something we should be filing later?
It may be safe to just go ahead and print it just like your personal notes if you have emails about a particular decision, and save them at least as long as you're on the board.
You're going to have to give the explanation.
Yeah.
On how many football fans we have here, but, you look at Tom Brady and his cell phone. Again, it may look bad.
No, and I'm religious about
Yep.
some filing, all that stuff. What
Yep.
I'm just wondering is whether there's an actual obligation that the city has a policy about board members maintaining documents for a certain period of time or whatever.
Not that I know. I know there's a legal obligation if you know there's maybe pending litigation to hold on to the documents.
We can also probably check our records retention schedule.
Yep, we can do that. It might be a number of years.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and check the recommendations in that. Is there any other questions? Okay. Great, thank you.
Yes, I do. I don't know how to. How do you make this cursor? Oh, you hit escape? Ah.
So,
And then you go.
yeah,
Oh. Record slideshow?
then go to begin. Begin. There you go.
And then how do you navigate it?
Arrows.
Left and right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicholas Bullock. I'm an assistant city attorney. I'll be the attorney for the Ethics Board. I'm the city's attorney for boards and commissions, and I'll be representing you guys. Basically, my role as the attorney for boards and commissions, or for any board that I sit on, is to be the rule guy. I make sure the board follows the Open Meetings Act. I answer any questions the board has related to the Open Meetings Act. I also help the board with its own rules and regulations and following those and making sure that the board's questions about those rules and regs are answered. If the board has any desire to amend its rules or regulations, I will be the one that is usually tasked with rewriting those and putting pen to paper and getting that drafted. I also, in the meetings that I'll be attending with you, I will be giving advice on how to conduct the meetings themselves, how to do motions, how to properly close meetings for closed session, all the sort of nuts and bolts things that make the meeting go. So with that being said, the main thing that I handle usually for my boards and commissions, and what I expect for this board as well, is dealing with the Open Meetings Act and ensuring the compliance of the board with the Open Meetings Act. So my presentation is going to begin with a discussion about the Open Meetings Act, otherwise known as OMA. Sort of in the same vein as IPRA, OMA is all about creating government transparency and trying to get as much information to the public as possible about what it is the government is doing through its agencies, its boards and commissions, to make sure that nothing is going on behind closed doors that the public is not aware of. So basically, the Open Meetings Act is going to apply to meetings of public bodies at which a quorum of the members of the public body are present in person or by telephone, and during which the public body will formulate public policy, discuss public business, or take action. The public body is generally defined as any policymaking board, commission, or administrative adjudicatory body. I believe the Ethics Board will fall under the category of being an administrative adjudicatory body for purposes of the Open Meetings Act. That being said, the Open Meetings Act is going to apply to the regular meetings of this board. On to the next slide. So what the Open Meetings Act says is that the formation of public policy or the conduct of business by vote shall not be conducted in closed meetings. So basically, we need to keep the meeting open to the public, allow the public to attend. There's all sorts of other things we need to make sure we comply with as far as notice and getting the agenda to the public that will be discussed later in this presentation. Next thing I would advise the board to do is to avoid the possibility of creating a rolling quorum. Mr. Locher described this briefly just previously with regard to the email situation, where board members will sometimes discuss cases on their merits via email to the other members of the board by simply hitting the reply all button and communicating with all of the board members about public business. And that would be a violation of the Open Meetings Act, because it would be a rolling quorum where we're no longer meeting in public, we're discussing things through an electronic communication not accessible or available to the public. Next thing, compliance with the Act is not just a matter of adhering to the Act's specific requirements, but contemplates a more flexible obligation to keep as open as possible. So if we're questionable about whether or not the Open Meetings Act applies to something, we are on the side of caution and try to make transparency the number one goal for anything that might be borderline about whether or not the Open Meetings Act applies or not. So as to formation of public policy, meetings of a public committee or a public body that is composed of less than a quorum of members or of non-members of the public body are not subject to the Act, provided that the committee only engages in fact-finding and does not have any sort of binding decision power upon the committee above it. So if you were to create a small subcommittee, that would be fine, and that small subcommittee would not be subject to the provisions of the Open Meetings Act, so long as that subcommittee is just a fact finder and doesn't do anything as far as creating binding decisions for the board above. Even a non-statutory committee appointed by a public body may constitute a public policy-making body, however, subject to the Open Meetings Act if it makes any decision on behalf of the board that binds it in any sort of practical way or in the strictly speaking way I just mentioned, or otherwise establishes some sort of policy for the body above it. A public body may not evade its obligations under the Open Meetings Act by delegating its responsibilities for making decisions to a small subcommittee. It can't make an alter ego out of one.
Question. In our rules, there's sort of a speed bump evaluation that takes place when a complaint comes in.
Correct.
Where the chairman and then two other board members form a committee, sort of a rotating committee, to do the initial evaluation to see whether that happens. And that, to me, historically has just taken place in the board conference after the board members had a chance to review those.
Okay.
So is that something that's okay for us to continue doing?
I do believe it's okay to continue doing. As long as the decision that's reached by that board isn't a final decision and is addressed by the full board, the fully comprised board, at an open meeting.
Well, as a practical matter, what happens is any one of those three people can ask for the complaint to go forward. It's almost like a probable cause test kind of thing.
Okay.
And then, or any other board member can ask that it go forward. So I'm not sure that it constitutes any final action. There's still an opportunity for anybody to reactivate the complaint.
Correct. As long as there's not a final action taking that's binding on the board above, then I believe that it would be okay for that committee to escape sort of the provisions of the Open Meetings Act and conduct its business by telephone. So, does that answer?
Am I right on that, Rex?
Yeah, I think you are right. I mean, that subcommittee takes the final action subject to any other board member saying, I want to hear it.
Okay. So it's only final after the board has looked at the recommendation, so to speak, of the subcommittee?
I think it could be interpreted.
This might be something on your list.
And I think
Because wouldn't the final action, if the three members on that committee decided not to move the complaint forward, isn't that a final act?
Subject to any other board member saying, I'd like to hear the complaint.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important too to couch those findings, so have some formality. So when the subcommittee is appointed, whether it's long-term or short-term, to have an assignment and then report back to the board with recommendations. It shouldn't be, well, even it could be for reviewing, some of a preliminary review of matters, but it certainly, that's the best way to do it. And then that way, the final decision then would be, of course, in an open meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Tillman had a form. I mean, the subcommittee would meet, would review the complaint, we'd have a telephone conference, and let's say the decision was, this complaint doesn't state it, we're going to dismiss it. And then he could send out a form to the entire board, as I recall, and it would say, here's what the subcommittee has decided to do. If anybody wants to hear this, respond within a certain period of time. But it would
Yes, I agree. It's like a proposed summary disposition or something that kind of automatically takes effect upon a lack of action. I think that could actually be considered. That, yeah, I'd like to look at that to see if it.
It would be safer to just go ahead and have a meeting on something like that.
Yeah, the personnel board does something similar where we have a fact finder that sort of upholds or does not uphold the proper termination of an employee, but his decision is purely a recommendation that goes up to a higher board, and then that board reviews everything below and then decides whether or not that was proper recommendation or not. I think if something like that were found to be the case here, then we'd be fine, as long as it's just a recommendation that's coming up to the board and not something that has a real effect.
That is that the whole reason for that is that we don't have regular meetings. We only have meetings when there is a petition or complaint to be considered.
Mhm.
And so this keeps everybody come in on a Friday afternoon and sit down in a public meeting and say yes or no.
Mhm.
So I like I see the idea of a recommendation, but if there's anything, if you keep this type of process intact, it'll save everybody a whole bunch of time because we dispose of a lot of frivolous complaints
Okay.
through that process.
Okay.
You know, one of the problems that we have with open meetings is that the press is looking at everything. And they want to be invited, they want to know what's going on. And kind of related to what I said before, the appearances is very important. Trustees, all of you having dinner one night, it's going to raise some questions. And the more transparent you can make it, and the more, and I think where we're getting to, the decisions need to be discussed and an open meeting the public can go to. And so, voting, giving your comments in writing, or if you oppose it, then let us know. That is really what the Open Meetings Act is to prevent, is to allow the public to be present or to have knowledge of the meeting itself. Even if you just get together and you look at 10 different aspects and 10 different complaints or decisions, as long as you have a public meeting that makes the final decision, that's what the public is entitled to see. And so, if almost any time there's a question, I'd almost err on the side of transparency. Again, that makes it more difficult. This is a difficult act.
Yeah, it's in our procedure.
Yeah, I'm looking at it like,
The summary dismissal section? Yeah.
for the election code, it's
The 10-day.
section B, 6B. It's,
Yeah, I got it right here.
when a complaint comes into the clerk, she distributes it to all the board members. Any board member can decide or ask for a preliminary hearing.
Yeah.
If no board member asks for it, then the chair appoints this subcommittee,
Mhm.
3 people. And they look at it, and it says if 3 board members agree that no violation of the code of ethics is stated in the complaint shall be dismissed without a preliminary hearing.
That presents a problem if that meeting is not being conducted subject to the provisions of the Open Meetings Act.
We have a regulation here, we probably need to make some changes.
Kind of like
Yep.
the city charter with the case law. Hopefully those will be updated so it doesn't mislead anyone. But this,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's also.
yes, and yeah, that's what I'm saying though. Is
Yep.
that the regulation should be consistent with ordinances. And
And keep minutes. Yeah, and post an agenda, and it's quite a bit. Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry I mentioned it.
yeah. Oh, this isn't the first time we've come across. I've come across
That's
this.
the problem that all committees and in all levels of government face. And transparency is the point of the Open Meetings Act. It is hard to comply with sometimes. It makes it a lot more cumbersome.
Yeah, it seems to me that the easier way to do that would be to dispense with this subcommittee and just take everything to the full board.
That might be the most efficient, expeditious way.
And actually, too, I believe that a lot of these complaints come in pretty rapidly just before an election, so you may get 3 or 4, and it doesn't mean you'd have to have 4 meetings, but you could put those all on the agenda to be heard.
Yep.
It seems like all the activities within about a month to 6 weeks for the election, pretty much.
Okay. So we'll take a look at revising that rule, perhaps, or changing the rules and regs.
And we have the same thing in the rules and regs for code of ethics.
The same?
It's basically the same mechanism under the code of ethics, rules and regulations, summary dismissal
Okay.
procedures.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Okay. Any further questions on? Any further questions on it, or can we move forward? Okay. All right. All right. So now we move on to notice requirements under the Open Meetings Act. For non-emergency meetings, reasonable advance notice of the meeting must be provided. The notice must comply with the deadlines and procedures for meeting notices adopted by the public body pursuant to the Open Meetings Act and pursuant also to our own rules. The notice must include the date, time, and location of the meeting. It must be published in a place or manner accessible to the public. Furthermore, OMA requires that we convene at least once a year and draft some sort of resolution or amendment to our rules that states when and what time and what we think is reasonable for notice for our meetings. So yearly we must do that. Further notice requirements include we need to provide to all FCC licensed broadcast stations and newspapers of general circulation that have provided a written request for notice of the notice of our meetings. The notice must include an agenda or information on how the public can obtain a copy of the agenda.
This can be placed on the website, is that correct, Natalie? We just go ahead and post the minutes. And
We do that for labor board and personnel.
Yep.
so a website fulfills that for everybody.
That's how we do it. Under certain limited circumstances, we can hold emergency meetings, which can be held with very little advance notice if the public body did not expect the circumstances giving rise to the meeting, and if the public body does not act immediately. Injury or damage to persons or property or substantial financial loss will occur if the meeting doesn't happen. So that would be the criteria required to hold an emergency meeting. As far as the agenda, our agenda must include specific items that we plan to discuss or transact or take final action on at the meeting. It must clearly describe the agenda items that we intend to discuss or act on during the meeting in order to give adequate public notice so that people know what it is exactly we're going to be talking about at the meetings. And except for emergency meetings, the agenda should be available to the public, or actually must be available to the public, at least 72 hours before the meeting. Except for emergency matters, the public body takes action only on those items specifically listed on the agenda 72 hours in advance. As far as telephonic participation at meetings is concerned, OMA does allow for telephonic appearances of members at meetings. If a member of the public body participates in a meeting by telephone, there must be a law or rule of the public body authorizing its members to participate by conference, telephone, or similar communications equipment, and it must be difficult or impossible for that member to attend the meeting in person. And each member participating telephonically can be identified when speaking. All participants are able to hear each other all the time, and it's clear who is speaking, and the person on the other end of the phone must be aware of what's actually going on. As far as closed meetings, the Ethics Board will be allowed to go into closed session to discuss certain matters pursuant to the Open Meetings Act. We are only allowed to do it in certain circumstances under certain exceptions to OMA. Basically what would happen is someone would make a motion to go into closed session. Any members of the public would leave the room and we can enter into closed session so long as we have the adequate grounds to do so. We are allowed to go into closed session in order to facilitate deliberations about the issuance, suspension, renewal, or revocation of a license. I don't think we'll be doing that. The two below here are going to be the relevant portions that will give us grounds to go into a closed session. For instance, the discussion of hiring, demotion, promotion, dismissal, assignment, or resignation of public employees, or the investigation or consideration of complaints or charges against public employees. So that would be a ground to enter into a closed session. Furthermore, deliberations in connection with the administrative adjudicatory proceeding held by the public body. That's going to be probably a fairly common reason for why the board would want to enter into closed session to discuss basically what the hearing was before it and what the merits were of it prior to taking action on the matter. So we can also go into closed session for the discussion of personally identifiable information about an individual student pursuant to OMA. We can also go into closed session for discussion of collective bargaining strategy prior to negotiations between a public body and a union representing employees of the public body, collective bargaining sessions involving the public body and union, and consultations of impasse and resolution procedures at which the public body and the union are present. I don't think that one really applies. We can also discuss the sole source purchase that exceeds $2,500 or of a contents of a competitive sealed proposals during the contract negotiation process, or meetings with the public body's attorney regarding threatened or pending litigation in which the public body is or may become a participant. Discussions of the purchase, acquisition, or disposal of real property or water rights is another ground for going into closed session. These ones, there's some other grounds here, but they're not really relevant to why we would be doing it since we're not boards of hospitals. I'm going to go ahead and just skip those. So in order to actually go into a closed session, there's a few procedures that need to be undertaken. First, there needs to be a motion stating the provision of law authorizing the closed meeting and a reasonably specific description of the subject to be discussed. So any member can make a motion saying, I think we need to go into closed session in order to discuss our role as an administrative adjudicatory body in adjudicating this complaint that came to us. And they would cite the provision of OMA that allows for that, and then there would be a roll call vote on the motion to close the meeting. The vote of each member is recorded in the minutes. It's important that each member state their name and their vote on the record for the minutes, so that's reflected on there as to how they voted. Only the matters stated in the motion to close the session are discussed in the closed session. So you can only discuss the matter that you've expressly stated you're going to discuss in the open meeting at the closed meeting. Action on the item discussed in a closed session must be taken in an open meeting. So although you can discuss what you're going to the closed session for, you can't take a vote in there about the action you're going to take. You have to come back out of closed session, basically state to the public body that you have only discussed that limited matter in closed session, and then hold a vote about how you're going to rule. So I just said that right here. And also, if the board does contemplate going into closed session on matters that it's going to be hearing at a particular date, it should include on its agenda the fact that it contemplates going into closed session. So if we're going to have a hearing on one day in the week, we should contemplate if we're going to go into closed session to deliberate on that hearing and the merits of it, and make sure that we put that on the agenda notice. So the agenda notice should say the board contemplates going into closed session pursuant to OMA section such and such to discuss this hearing matter on this date, and make sure the public gets advance notice of it.
Executive session.
Executive session? They had one on there about attorney-client. Yeah. Okay. So, Okay, so like I said, following completion of the closed meeting, a statement is entered into the minutes on the next open meeting, specifying that the matters discussed in the closed meeting were limited to those stated in the notice of the closed meeting. So as to minutes, if the meeting is open, written minutes are required. Minutes must contain at least the date, time, and place of the meeting, and names of all members of the public body attending the meeting and of those members who are absent, and a description of the substance of all proposals considered during the meeting, and record of any decisions made and votes taken that show how each member voted. Voting by secret ballot is not permitted under the Open Meetings Act.
Who takes the minutes?
One of the city clerk staff will be doing that. Lucinda, do you know exactly who will be doing it? Lucinda? Okay. All right. So Lucinda will be doing the minutes. So furthermore on, yes, Rex.
Do you prepare sort of a description for the chair? I mean, does he have like a piece of paper that you put together that tells him specifically how to close the meeting so that we can deliberate?
Sure, I can.
Is that something that the chair should just do on his own?
I can prepare that. You mean like procedurally how to make the motion to close the meeting? I think I've done that before for a police oversight board. I made kind of a sort of quick thing for that. I could create that very easily and distribute it to the board chair so that he can do it exactly how it's supposed to be done. Sure.
Of course, we don't have a chair.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, Gary brings up a good point. Usually on these complaints, we just deliberate open,
Okay. And you can.
and that's fine.
Yeah, you can do that, certainly, yes. And you could also go into closed session to discuss it as well, if you'd like.
Add something about closed sessions. In my experience, I think the only ones I've seen city council do are for attorney-client discussions about pending litigation. So
I just did one.
if favoring, you have that option, but certainly if you don't need to use it, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. So furthermore on minutes, a draft copy of the minutes is prepared within 10 working days of the public meeting. So we have to get that out to the public within 10 days. Minutes are approved, amended, or disapproved at the next meeting where a quorum of the public body is present. Usually that's one of the first things on the agenda. All minutes are available for public inspection. I believe that's possible, correct? People can go down to the clerk's office and get a copy of the minutes. Members of the public could go down to the clerk's office. It's also on the website? Okay.
Once they've been finalized, once they have been approved by the board.
Okay. And so
Where's
John would love this, actually.
John, your voice.
So how many of you have sat on boards before? 3 out of 4? Okay. So I apologize if some of this is repetitive, but I decided to also add on to my OMA presentation something about Robert's Rules of Order, which are basically the rules of parliamentary procedure that are followed by all boards and commissions in the absence of rules and regulations adopted by that board or commission for how it conducts its meetings. It's basically how you make a motion, how you amend motions, that sort of technical procedure as well, since I find myself advising boards on that sort of thing on a regular basis as well. So the Robert's Rules of Evidence, or Robert's Rules of Order, rather, are named after Henry Robert, who was a mid-19th century Army engineer and brigadier general in the U.S. Army. He served in the Pig and Potato War of 1859, as well as in the U.S. Civil War. He created the defense works around Washington, D.C. The objects of the Rules of Order is to assist an assembly to accomplish in the best possible manner the work for which it was designed. To do this is necessary to restrain the individual somewhat, as the right of an individual in any community to do what he pleases is incompatible with the interests of the whole. Where there is no law, but every man does what he right in his own eyes, there is the least of real liberty. So, Robert's rules seek to, I guess, formalize and regulate public meetings in a way that seems fair and is clear to the public. So, with regard to making a motion, there are 6 steps. Step number 1, a member is recognized and makes a motion. Another member will then second the motion. The presiding officer, in this case the chair, restates the motion to the assembly. The members then debate the motion. The presiding officer or chair asks for the affirmative votes and then the negative votes. And the last step, the presiding officer announces the result of the voting, instructs the corresponding officer to take action, and introduces the next item of business on the agenda. So that is the proper procedure for making a motion. And here are a list of things that are commonly done as mistakes at open meetings regarding motions and so forth. For instance, motions which conflict with laws, any sort of law, federal, state, local, or with the bylaws of our own committee or constitution or the rules of the organization are out of order. You simply can't make them, and they can be summarily rejected by the board. Motions which present something already was rejected during the same session or conflict with a motion already adopted are likewise motions that are out of order. Motions which conflict or present substantially the same question as one that was already disposed of are likewise out of order. Motions which propose actions beyond the scope of the organization's bylaws are going to be out of order. However, a 2/3 vote may allow this kind of motion in order to override our own rules and regulations. And how to modify a motion. So there are 5 steps to doing this. So between the time that a motion is made and before the chair, it says states the motion, but that's supposed to be restates the motion, any member may informally offer modifying suggestions to the maker of the motion. The maker may accept or reject the member's recommendations. After the chair has stated the motion, restated the motion, the maker of the motion may request unanimous consent from the members to modify the motion that was put forward. Remember that at this time, the motion belongs to the assembly and not the original maker. By means of a subsidiary motion to amend, any member may propose changes to the motion before the motion is voted upon. These proposed changes must be seconded and may be amended and or debated. If a motion requires further study, the members can also do a thing called refer the main motion to a committee. So the committee can return the motion to the assembly. The committee normally proposes amendments for the assembly to vote upon. So a committee can kind of seek to modify the motion as well. Sometimes in regards to a motion that's really complex, the only way to do justice for it is for another member to urge the rejection because it's so complex and to offer and propose a similar motion that's a little bit more simple to get across, and this motion type of motion is called a substitute motion. Upon defeat of the complex motion, anyone may propose the substitute motion. So here's an example of how an amendment would work. So a sample motion would be someone moves the body to say, I move that we buy a new sign. You can move to amend by inserting words or paragraphs to it. You can say, I move to amend by inserting the phrase, not to exceed $50 at the end of the motion. You can also move to amend by striking, not deleting words or paragraphs. So the term of art to use would be to say, I move to amend by striking the word new from new sign. You can also move to amend by striking out or inserting words or paragraphs. So one can say, I move to amend by striking out the word sign and inserting the word billboard. So you can amend a motion by those manners. And here are a few sort of no-nos where people use these oftentimes in meetings and committees that don't really have any sort of meaning under Robert's Rules of Evidence. People often say things like, so moved. This is a common statement which means absolutely nothing. One must state the actual motion so as to avoid confusion in the audience. So always restate it. Everyone has the right to know exactly what is being moved here. Some people will also say, I move to table. That's not exactly how it's done. The motion is actually, I move to lay on the table. And according to Robert's Rules of Order, this motion is in order only as a temporary interruption on the agenda, so as to allow something special and urgent out of turn. People usually use this as an alternative for like trying to kill a motion, but that's not how it's done. If you want to kill the motion, you just say, I move to postpone this indefinitely. There's another phrase, call for the question. This is likewise not a motion. The person calling question is out of order. At best, this is a nagging hint to the chair to stop the discussion and get on with the voting of it. It is critical that the chair not automatically stop the discussion when someone says call for the question. The disorderly member who wishes to stop the discussion does not have more rights than any other members who wish to discuss the issue. Actually, a motion to stop the discussion, I move the main question, would require an actual vote in order to be adopted. You can't unilaterally try to kill a motion. So, that's actually all I have for Robert's Rules of Evidence, Robert's Rules of Order, rather. Any questions on Robert's Rules? No?
So our chair is not, mindful of things are out of order. You will make sure that you're following procedures that you're.
Correct. I forgot to mention that. I'll try and step in and try to correct things when I see them.
Because I know he stressed the importance of procedure. That's obviously part of it.
Yeah. Okay. And so I'm also going to present a bit, and I don't have a PowerPoint for this, but I wanted to present on the rules and regs for the board. And we've already discussed these a little bit in regards to the subcommittee and whether or not it violates the OMA. I believe it's going to be found under tab number 5 in your materials. We have a printed out outline for the rules and regs of the board, briefly explaining in a nutshell what they do, what our rules say. Basically, what our rules and regs for the ethics board do is they they supplement and support the Code of Ethics and Election Code by offering additional and more specific provisions for the conduct of the board's activities and for the interpretation and enforcement of the Code of Ethics and the Election Code. They spell out the nuts and bolts of how we do our hearings, how we find people, how we do investigations, and they also clarify some of the things that are used in the Code of Ethics and Election Code. So one of the things they do is they explain how the board conducts its activities. And the first thing it does is it explains the role of the city clerk insofar as election matters are concerned. Where and how candidates file campaign declarations, disclosures, materials, and other forms, and some specific requirements for financial disclosures and campaign advertising. All of this is going to be spelled out by our rules. The role of the city clerk is as follows under our rules. Questions about election matters are directed to the city clerk or campaign and election auditor, so questions from the public. Campaign declarations, disclosures, and materials are filed with the office of the city clerk. Our rules also state that the person's filing campaign declarations, disclosures, materials, or other forms is responsible for requesting and obtaining dated and timed receipts from the clerk. All filed documents must be complete according to the election or ethics code and the rules. The board holds orientations for candidates and measure finance committees. Our rules also go on to describe more about campaign financial disclosure, specifically the requirements thereof. First of all, they do state that contributions not reported due to amount must be recorded so that the cumulative contributions over the minimum amount can be reported. Anonymous contributions must be recorded in the contribution portion of the financial disclosure statement and in the expenditure portion, indicating either the disposition of the city's general fund or identified charity. Further, they also state that financial disclosure statements must include office space information, a notarized statement of the person or business providing the office space, stating its fair market value and actual cost to the candidate or measure finance committee, a detailed accounting of all advertising expenses delineated according to type, for example, respective costs for print and broadcast media, billboards, other signage, bumper stickers, T-shirts, and buttons. The fair market value of specialized advertising such as hot air balloons, and also the number and types of signs together with costs of each, cost of materials, or fair market value of donated signs and billboards. They also explain more about advertising campaign materials and the specific requirements thereof. For instance, the rules state that campaign materials must be properly identified, specifying the name of the sponsor and printer. And they also must be properly filed with the board. So our rules also aid in the interpretation of the election code and the ethics code. The rules clarify when volunteered services are contributions and the manner of valuating property provided campaigns at a discount. The rules also establish the procedure for advisory opinions, which the board has apparently never issued before. Volunteered services and use of property discounted prices are provided for under the rules. It states that personal services provided to a candidate or Measure Finance Committee without compensation are not contributions, except when they are commercial or professional, such as an individual volunteering time to assemble signs. That person would not be making a contribution. However, an attorney volunteering time to represent a candidate before the Board of Ethics is, because they're operating in their professional capacity. And furthermore, the use of property provided to a candidate or Measure Finance Committee at a discounted price are contributions with fair market value determined as demonstrated in the rules. So the rules and regulations of the Ethics Board also discuss in detail what advisory opinions are about and how the board produces these. So the first thing is a candidate may request an advisory opinion about his or her own potential future conduct involving a real or potential conflict. The candidate files this request with the city clerk on a form approved by her. The request must include all material facts. A subcommittee of the board, the chair, vice chair, and third member of the board designated by the chair on an ad hoc basis reviews the request, may require the candidate to provide additional information or appear before it to answer questions. The subcommittee makes recommendations to the entire board. The board reviews the recommendation at a hearing that may be attended by the candidate. The board shall issue its advisory opinion only after a majority of the entire membership of the board has voted in its favor. The request of an advisory opinion remains confidential until the recommendation is before the board. Subcommittee meetings are not open to the public. The review hearing before the board is an open meeting. I believe this would comply with OMA since the subcommittee here is simply issuing a recommendation. And the final action to be taken would be taken by the fully comprised board at a meeting subject to the Open Meetings Act. So I don't believe there's any problem here with that under the OMA. A candidate who receives an advisory opinion may rely on the opinion as a defense against a complaint of an alleged violation if all material facts are disclosed in the request. The candidate complied with the opinion and the allegation comprises the same facts. And lastly, an advisory opinion may be used by the complainant and respondent, but it is not binding on the board unless it is one found by the board to have been issued and complied with by the respondent under the same facts. So those are our rules and regulations for advisory opinions. And so the rules and regulations also describe how the ethics and election codes are enforced. The Code of Ethics and Election Code contain general enforcement provisions. As Bob discussed earlier, the board's rules and regulations contain additional and more specific provisions for the conduct of the board's activities and for the interpretation and enforcement of the Code of Ethics and Elections Code. For instance, some of the general provisions in the charter for the Code of Ethics state that any private citizen may initiate a charge of violation complaint to the board. The board may then hold a preliminary hearing at which it accepts the complaint. After the preliminary hearing, the board may decide to refer the complaint for investigation by contracted investigators or city staff, including staff of the Office of Internal Audit. After a hearing, the board may make a public reprimand or impose a fine not to exceed $500 for each violation or both. Failure of an elected official, either the mayor or the city councilor, to file a quarterly financial report after 10-day notice of right to cure results in an automatic mandatory fine, as I believe Jane stated. The board may request the council to suspend or remove an official, and the council may do so on a vote of 2/3 of the councilors qualified to vote. Appeals of the decisions of the board or council are heard by the district court. As far as general provisions for the election code, are concerned, the election code states that a charge of violation complaint is brought to the board for the board, or the board may initiate a charge on its own initiative. Complaints must include specific information about the alleged violation of the election code and the circumstances surrounding them. The board must provide the candidate with written notice of the charge. The board may establish a complaint committee to review complaints for completeness. The campaign and election auditors shall investigate the charge. After a hearing, the board may issue a public reprimand to impose a fine not to exceed the maximum under state law or both. Upon failure to file disclosures, the board will afford the candidate notice to cure within 10 days. If not cured, the board must impose mandatory fines and may recommend to the council that the successful candidate be removed from office upon a 2/3 vote. And likewise, appeals of discipline imposed under the election code are heard by the district court. So, what the rules and regulations have to say about enforcement is that they specify a little bit more about what a complaint is. The general provisions don't really go into much description of that, but our rules and regs do. What they say is that a complaint for a violation must comply with the following requirements. The complaint must be written, it must be notarized, and verified statement filed with the city clerk on an approved form. It must include a clear and concise statement of the alleged events, include documentation about the time, place, circumstances of the alleged violation, and the names of any witnesses. It must also include the provision of the election code alleged to have been violated. It must also allege a violation that has not occurred more than 120 days prior to the date the complaint was filed, unless the alleged facts and events were not public knowledge within that time frame. Our rules and regs also go on to describe a process for summary dismissals, which we kind of discussed earlier when we were talking about OMA. So we have procedures for following these summary dismissals, and they are these. The city clerk will send a copy of the complaint to each board member along with the names of the board members assigned to the review committee. Upon the board member's request for a preliminary hearing within 10 days of receipt of the complaint, the clerk will schedule such a hearing, and the summary dismissal process is no longer an option. If no request for a preliminary hearing is submitted, the complaint is reviewed by the review committee, and the review committee is comprised of the chair and 2 other members designated by the chair on alphabetical rotation. The committee will decide whether the complaint states a violation. If the 3 members decide that the complaint does not state a violation, then it is dismissed. Otherwise, the case is set for a preliminary hearing. The complainant may appeal a summary decision by doing so within 10 calendar days of receipt of the dismissal. A preliminary hearing is scheduled upon a timely appeal. All right, and so the rules and regs also discuss in further depth what a response to a complaint is supposed to be comprised of, and also more information on preliminary hearings. So basically, a respondent may file a statement as to why the complaint fails to state a violation, provided that it is filed within 10 calendar days before the preliminary hearing. The city clerk provides the complainant and board members copies of the respondent's statement 3 working days before the preliminary hearing. No testimony is taken at the preliminary hearing, but the parties may present argument as to why a violation should be found or why the complaint should be dismissed. The complaint may be dismissed on the following grounds. Number 1, lack of jurisdiction. Number 2, untimely filing. Number 3, failure to state a violation. Even if the facts are true, if there's no violation present, it can be dismissed. Frivolous grounds for harassment, mootness, and an advisory opinion defense. So, and likewise, any appeal of a final decision of the board at a preliminary hearing is reviewed by the district court. The rules also go on to discuss how we handle the settlement process in our hearings. So a settlement process would occur in a situation where a respondent candidate may offer to settle the complaint against him or her by simply admitting to the violation. Requesting a settlement conference they will then request a settlement conference with the board staff where a settlement agreement is developed and submitting the proposed agreement to the board for its approval. The board may accept the settlement by a majority of the members present. The next part of our rules and regs deals with investigations. Our rules and regulations state that by an affirmative vote of at least 4 votes, the board may cause an investigation of any of the allegations before it. The board may use staff of the Office of Internal Audit and Investigations, city staff assigned to the board, or contractors. The selection is by a majority of the board present. The selection process must be documented. And then the next part of our rules and regs deals with hearings. It states that hearings will be conducted according to the following procedures. 1, the board will provide at least 14 days written notice of hearings to all parties. The notice shall contain a brief description of the matter to be heard. The parties must each then provide the clerk and other parties with a written statement of all issues, a witness list, and expected testimony, copies of documentary evidence at least 10 days prior to the hearing. The parties may submit evidence. That's not irrelevant, immaterial, or unduly repetitious. Hearsay evidence is admissible at these hearings, though anonymous statements are not. The board's decision is based on evidence normally relied upon by reasonable persons. So that seems to be kind of a broad discretion for evidence. But as long as the evidence is reasonably relied upon, it's admissible at the hearing. The decision must be based on at least some evidence admissible in a court of law, basically just a restatement of the legal residuum rule. The chair is also the presiding officer at the hearing, unless he's delegated that authority. And basically his duties include ruling on the admissibility of evidence and procedural issues, or she, rather. He or she then can also issue subpoenas and also ask me, the city attorney, to apply for a court order compelling compliance with the administrative subpoenas. And the chair can also limit testimony as necessary at hearings. So the proceedings are as follows at the hearings. There will be opening statements. Complainant goes first. Respondent goes next. Complainant presents their case. They're allowed to call witnesses on direct examination. They're also allowed to cross-examine respondents' witnesses when respondents testifies. So after complainant is finished with their case, respondent does their case, and all witnesses are available to direct and cross-examination. Rebuttal is allowed by the complainant, and then there's just closing statements. It's pretty similar to a regular trial. The record is, of course, going to be recorded audio by a member of the city clerk staff. Our rules then go on to describe how fines are imposed. The board may impose a fine not to exceed a maximum set by law, $500 for each violation of the election code, or these rules, or issue a public reprimand or both. Fines for failure to file disclosures after the time to cure has expired are subject to mandatory fines of $100 for each failure to file disclosures, and $500 fine for failure to appear at the mandatory meeting concerning campaign financial records on the Friday before the election. And another part of our rules says that ex parte communications are not allowed between the complainant or the respondent, members of the board. If anyone tries to have an ex parte communication with you, please let me know about it, and I will get in contact with them and see what it is they want and see if I can resolve it myself. So that's all I have for what the rules and regs have to say about clarifying the election code and the ethics code. So I believe that concludes my presentation. Any questions? Okay. Cool. Oh, thank you.
was a little unclear about occupation and industry, what you put there and where it goes. So that's both, either or, and that'll show up when you are increasing distribution. You have that option right there.
So that was one of the areas where we wanted to make sure that if it is a CAO, but if it's from a construction company, that you indicate the industry, even if their exact title won't be on there. So I wanted to introduce you to our Board of Ethics members. Their role is to deal with election-related matters in violation of the Code of Ethics. So they do review all of your reports. And we have some new members and some seasoned members as well. You could get Stan so everyone can see you. We have Rex Throckmorton. This is Rex. Rex, how long have you been on the board?
3 years.
3 years. We have Gary Van Lushen. You have been on the board how long, Gary?
I think a year.
Okay. We have Eric Garcia. And he just is brand spanking new. And then we have James Green, who was unable to make it here. He's also new. And then we have a proposed appointee who you'll be hearing. Some of you will hear at next week's council meeting, Georgia Scott. So I'm going to turn it over to our auditors. We have 2 auditors that look at all of your material. They're going to give you tips. They're going to give you rules and regulations. And they're also here to answer any questions. One of the great things about them is they're very accessible. If you don't have their phone numbers, I'm sure they'll give them to you now. If you have any questions or if you doubt anything, please call them because it is better to err on the side of transparency. We heard today. And this is Eric Loper, who is our attorney for the city clerk's office. He also knows everything about everything, is what I think. And so,
I am Helen Elliott, and this is John Grisham, and we are the election auditors. Basically, what we do is we look for compliance. So we file your financial disclosure statements, and based on what Nick has indicated as far as the city charter, the articles for the election code, the open and ethical code, along with the regulations for the Code of Ethics. Basically, we're looking for compliance with those documents. So everybody should have a copy of the documents. They're available online with the city clerk's office. And so that's basically what we're doing, and we're here to assist you and inform the board as far as the filings and what is happening with your financial disclosure statements. Remember, there's 8 statements that must be filed even after the election so that we finalize the reports, all the income that comes in, all the expenses that go out. Some candidates are publicly financed, some are privately financed. So it's important that the rules and regulations are adhered to. As far as the contributions, I think we just went over a few little issues with this new filing system as to how the information is input into the system. But if you do have questions, please call us. We've got business cards in the back. They're accessible either email or phone call at any time that you might have. Some issues that we've found over the years that kind of cause questions, and that's basically like the nature of contributors' business. I know a lot of them who were putting like business owner as a description, which really is not as informative as we would like to see, especially if the business name is like John Jones LLC. It really doesn't describe what type of business they're involved in. So it would be helpful if we had like engineer, architect, that type of description as far as the nature of the business. Expenditures, that's pretty self-explanatory until we get to advertising. If you'll notice in the rules and regulations, the advertising wants more description as to what you're buying as far as broadly distributed materials. So for instance, we want the size of the information like a yard sign, the quantity, maybe 100 yard signs, and make sure your advertising complies with who the printer is, who the campaign is, who the treasurer is. I think they've gone through that with the details as far as the city charter and the rules and regulations require. In-kind contributions, that's, I think, easy enough. Just make sure it's fair market value for what you've received. If you have a billboard requires a notarized statement from the billboard company. So keep that in mind. Measure finance committees. If you're involved in the measure finance committees, they're basically reported just like anybody else. If you come into existence after the filing, you still need to go to the city clerk's, register, and basically get your measure finance committee set up. And I think this is an issue that we had in the past elections, and that is PAC organizations donating to candidates or maybe other measure finance committees. The definition on a measure finance committee is anytime you spend $250 in support of a candidate or a measure, you must register as a measure finance committee. So we might keep that in mind if you're involved in some organization that wants to submit a contribution to a candidate or another measure. Keep that in mind. Sure, anything else that we need to kind of touch on? Any questions that you might come up? I know we had a question on the first filing, Brad, regarding individuals that have contracts with the city. They're basically listed on the city website, and you're prohibited from accepting a contribution from an individual, or suppose a business that has a contract, and I believe there's a $20,000 limit on it. So contracts over $20,000, if the individual has a contract with the city that's current, then you're precluded from contributing to a candidate. Yes?
If they're an employee or even a partner in a company, but they want to give individually, then that is not a prohibition.
That is correct, as long as, and I think this is what we discussed, as long as the contract is to the business and not the individual.
So the individual.
But the business itself would not be able to contribute.
Basically, we just want to put a face with your name so that as you go through your filing, run into a question, please call. There's no limit on the amount of money that you can raise if you're privately financed. Publicly financed, they've already received their allotment of funds. There is a limit on how much you can receive from one candidate, or one contributor rather, $875, or business, $875. A husband and wife can both contribute each one. So it should be fairly easy to comprehend, but there's always a question or two. You get to the day before you need to file, please call. It's easier that way. There's a mandatory meeting the Friday before the election. Basically, we review the statements of that filing for that day, ask any questions that we might have in regard to that filing, or any maybe previous filings, or if you've corrected or amended a previous filing, basically look at that. And remember, the Monday before the election, there's another statement. So there's 8 statements. You need to be aware of all the dates on your calendar. And by noon, file it with the city clerk and do the affidavit. Or if you forget to do the affidavit, affidavit. You filed online, but you didn't send the affidavit into the city clerk's office. Please do that. Yes?
The affidavit can be the day that you file.
Yes, yes. You can email it,
That
fax
doesn't
it.
have to be confirmed.
Yes. Advertising materials, make sure that as you print them, or if you print them off, like email, that type of thing, a copy has to go to the city clerk's office. If you're doing a telephone robocall or a radio ad, TV ad, the script of the announcement needs to be sent to the city clerks right when you basically broadly distribute it. So make sure that they get a copy, either email a picture of a yard sign or give them the yard sign, flyers, they're getting that information.
What are the rules on social media? Do they have to submit tweets or anything that they do?
If they've got a website, I'd say, print that opening website so that you have a copy of that.
It's same with like the skin on like a Facebook page or like a LinkedIn page, that kind of thing.
So that,
Why would the transcripts of tweets be required similar to the other ones?
I suppose that it's broadly distributed, and of course this is somewhat new to the system, and it's not really detailed in the regulations, but I suppose if you send out a tweet or to, 1,000 people, then the city clerk should get a copy of that tweet.
And that limit, that the definition of broadly distributed is 100.
I believe so.
So if I get 99 tweets, or,
If you have 99 followers, right?
you know, I don't know what I'm talking about. If I tweeted to 99 persons, then
I think that was mostly for in-house distribution, paperwork.
Well, and just something that came up recently is that we did some printing for art in-house that was distributed.
Right, so that
kind of thing raises a question when you see it on.
It depends on if it gets out.
And how one question it can be straight. But I just want to put in a pitch that I'm hoping not having to do too much of this time around, but having run for office 3 times previous, that almost always been very quickly responsive. And if you just lay a question out to her, either answer it on the spot or we'll get back there.
We try. One other item, if you're running unopposed and you receive city funds, you've got to return those funds quickly to the city clerk's office. Once that's established. And at the end, if you have money left over, charity, city clerk, give it back to your contributor.
So we kind of blew past the electronic stuff. But taking those, Twitter is a broadcast mechanism. So is Facebook and others. I would think if you're posting stuff on there, it would be similar to a robocall.
True.
It would be required that they're posting the transcript of that with the city clerk's office. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I think that makes sense. I mean, it's broadly distributed.
Correct.
It's no different than basically a radio ad.
Correct.
It's just that it's not speaking. It's out there.
But one of them is paid, the other is not.
Pardon me?
So like a radio ad is you pay for that or you're in kind of, whereas a Facebook page, unless you pay for the
I
advertising.
think that if you have a radio ad, they need to give a script to the city clerk. Plus, if it's donated, you'll need to do a fair market value as a contribution, or if you pay for it.
No, I understand that. What I'm saying is that that's exactly what differentiates Twitter from the radio. Is the radio is a purchased commodity, whereas your Twitter page you can't really buy your.
Well, you have an account, but it's broadly distributed.
You're not going to pay for yard space. Yes, you bought the yard sign.
Having a discussion at once. Having a couple of discussions at once, whether it's paid for or not, is whether it ends up on the campaign financial report. Whether it is provided to open elections is a matter of widely distributed. So whatever methodology you use for widely distributed, I would think has to go before the this group. I mean, it needs to be posted. It's not that they're approving it, but it has to be provided.
It's basically information for the public to make their decisions. And that's the whole goal of all of this information. It is, yes?
What about thank you letters for contributions? If you happen to send over 100 thank you letters, do we need to submit like a general copy of that? It's not really.
That's really to a specific individual, so I think you're fine there. As far as maybe a party at someone's house, and you pass the hat or the fishbowl and you throw money in, that's generally allocated to the person that's holding the function of the house. Yes?
What if it exceeds the amount of money that an individual can contribute?
For instance, at somebody's house, it ends up being $1,000 as opposed to $875.
They have to give back that amount?
You could always donate the difference to charity or something. Did you have a question over here?
Yeah, so going back to the social media thing, do you want a copy of each and every post and tweet? Is that what we decided? Or?
Well, if it's different, I mean, if you're sending the same one out, that's one thing, but if you're saying, okay, this week it goes to 1,000 people, and next week I'm writing up a different tweet, and I'm going to send it to another 1,000 people, or even the same 1,000 people, it's still a different message that you're distributing. So I would say yes.
Okay.
Until somebody. Yes.
I think the city for like 20 a day, yeah.
Yes.
Question about the actual date of receipt of the donation. How would you like that best put into the system? The date of deposit, date of signature?
I would probably say if you have a little receipt book that you're taking that information, I would say the date that you actually receive it.
That it was in hand. Okay, date in hand. I guess, yeah.
And along those same lines, if you've got expenses, and this is very important by the time you end up with that Friday before the election and the Monday both days, Monday and Friday before the election, you go out and basically produce 1,000 flyers on Friday, but you're not going to pay for them until 2 weeks away. That expenditure needs to be on your report. So if you've encumbered the funds, you've ordered the advertising or whatever expense, even though you have not paid for it, it must be on the system. Yes?
So what if we were like hand printing T-shirts?
Take a picture of it and send it over to the city clerk.
Okay, but it's like we're not going to make 100 T-shirts. Do we still have to do it?
I probably would because it's going to be somewhat broadly
Okay, seen
distributed.
by more than 100. Gotcha.
Or hopefully it will be. Yes?
For receiving contributions, I've been the one entering those in the system. For the date of receipt, do I need to put that date when it leaves the contributor's hand to Brad's or from Brad's to mine? What date would you recommend? Does that make sense? Because Brad will get a check, like a bunch of checks one day, but then they'll come into my office the next day, and then I'll receive those checks. So what would you recommend? What makes sense?
Probably if you have the date of the check, that would work. If you have there again the date of the receipt, if you have a receipt that comes with the check that's dated, I'd use that date. The main thing is make sure that we accumulate all of this information up until the day before you have to file the next statement. That's the important part, is how much have you received at each step along the way, and what have you spent or encumbered. And at the end, it's got to zero out. Remember that.
So now, based on what you said, in one of the system reports, if you use the date on the check, and you didn't receive it until a week later, and the date somebody wrote on the check, and you didn't receive it until a week later, take today. Last night was a filing time. So let's say they wrote the check on Thursday, you didn't receive it until Monday, you entered the system on Monday, put the date of the show you misfiled report. So I don't think I'd use the date of the check. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, the system
But I don't
probably
think
won't allow
what
it.
you just described.
So,
No, but I would think the date in hand though is still.
It hands
working
on,
as
you
a
look
traditional
at
wrap
the, look at the
sheet
mail
check.
on Monday, put it in
yeah,
on Monday.
probably the date in hand.
Or
Although
today.
be careful with that last Friday before the election, Monday before the election. Try and get everything inputted, because that's the most critical time.
But I wouldn't use the date on the check.
You know, probably, they might have written the check 3 months ago. And just give it to you. Yes, in the mail. Okay. Any other questions that you might have? If not, you might have some issues or some legal items that might have affected the charter.
Hi, I'm Eric Locher. I'm the assigned attorney to advise the city clerk. Actually, it was covered right now. Some of the case law about that has modified the charter provisions. I'll just summarize that briefly. There is no, as discussed, there's no longer a ban on corporate or other entities making contributions to your campaign. However, it's just that the cap is the same, $875 for council races. And also as discussed, the contributor, whether it's an individual or corporation, can't be a contractor. That's still in place. Employees or persons with an interest in a corporation could still donate, but it has to come from their personal funds and not the corporation. So those are allowed as well, even if the corporation itself cannot contribute because of its existing contract. And that rule is as long as there's a contract in effect on the date of donation, that would be the ban. The other, just to summarize too, the first case that modified the charter in terms of campaign finance was Homans versus City of Albuquerque, and that was back in 2001 in the 10th Circuit. And what that did is it removed the cap on donations. So the limits per contribution are still in place, but the candidates can raise as many individual contributions as they're able to. And let me check and see. There's a couple other ones. Oh, the other thing that provision of the public financing that's no longer in effect is the initial contribution, of course, is still in place as long as the campaign qualifies. However, the Article 16, Section 16 section on matching funds, which is when a publicly financed candidate could get additional funds to match the opponent, that is no longer in force because of the Arizona Free Enterprise Club's case against Bennett, who was the Secretary of State of Arizona. That was decided in 2011. So, the distribution, the initial one is perfectly fine under the case law. It's just the city clerk's office can no longer provide additional funds based on an opponent's raising of money. There has been some talk about amending the charter. It's not in effect yet to allow for matching funds to match more fundraising after the public finance distribution, but that's something in the future, and that would also pass this test. But for now, there's just the initial distribution. Does anybody have any questions about this case? These cases?
Can we have your number?
I'm sorry.
Can I get your?
Oh, sure. It's 768-4511. That's my direct number. It's Eric, E-R-I-C. Last name is Locher, L-O-C-H-E-R.